The healer's hands were trembling. That was the first thing anyone noticed in the room that night. Old Clara, who had delivered more than 300 babies in the Ashwood pack without a single tremor in her fingers, stood over the newborn with hands that shook like leaves in a storm. The mother, Nora Voss, lay exhausted on the bed, her dark hair stuck to her forehead with sweat, her eyes half open as she waited for what every new mother in the pack waited for. The sound. The small, specific sound that a wolf's spirit made when it entered a newborn child. It was a sound between a hum and a sigh, something that came from the baby's chest rather than its throat, and every parent in the Ashwood pack had heard it at least once in their lives. Clara pressed her ear close to the infant's chest. She listened for a long time. The father, Gareth Voss, stood near the door with his arms crossed tightly over his broad chest. He was the beta of the Ashwood pack, the second-ranking wolf in the entire territory, and he had spent the last 9 months preparing for this moment. He had already chosen a name for a son and a name for a daughter, and he had already decided which of the young pack warriors he would eventually select as a training partner for his child. He had it all arranged in his mind, the way he arranged everything. Neatly, logically, with no room for disorder. Clara straightened up slowly. She did not look at Nora, she looked at the wall. "Tell me," Gareth said. Clara turned to face him. Her eyes were wet, but she kept her voice steady out of respect for the mother still awake in the bed. "There is no wolf," she said quietly. "Not even a trace." The room went very still. Nora's breath caught in her throat. She pushed herself up onto her elbows and looked at her daughter, lying in the cloth on the table. The baby was small and pale and perfectly formed, with dark eyes open wide, as if she was already studying the ceiling with great seriousness. She did not cry. She had not cried since the moment she came into the world, which Clara had noted privately as unusual. Most newborns screamed. This one had simply opened her eyes and looked around. "That is not possible," Gareth said. His voice had gone flat in a way that meant he was controlling something. "I have been doing this for 40 years, Clara said. "I know what I hear, and I know what I do not hear." Gareth walked to the table and looked down at his daughter. The baby looked back up at him. She had his dark eyes, which should have pleased him. It did not please him. He studied her face for a long moment, and then he turned around and walked out of the room without another word. Nora lay back against the pillow and said nothing. She had learned a very long time ago that the things she said when Gareth was in a certain mood did not help anything, and sometimes made things worse. She waited until she heard his footsteps fade down the hall, and then she reached out her hand and touched her daughter's tiny fingers. "I am here," she whispered. The baby wrapped one small finger around her mother's thumb. Her name, when it was finally entered in the pack records 3 days later, was simply Alara. No wolf name followed it. In pack tradition, a wolf name was given alongside the birth name when the healer confirmed the presence of an inner wolf. It was the second name that announced to the world who you were becoming. Without it, a name on the records looked unfinished, like a sentence that stopped before the most important word. Alara Voss, 2 words, no future. She grew up knowing the difference between herself and every other child in the pack before she had the words to describe it. She knew it in the way that children know things, through the body first and the mind later. She felt it in the way conversations stopped when she walked up. She felt it in the way games reorganized themselves to leave her on the outside. She felt it in the way adults looked at her sometimes with something that was not quite pity and not quite discomfort, but somewhere in the middle of both. The other children began shifting for the first time between the ages of 8 and 12. It was one of the most celebrated events in pack life. A first shift meant a first wolf, and a first wolf meant the beginning of a true pack member's life. Families held small gatherings. The pack elder offered a blessing. The child would come back the next morning with dirt on their knees, and grass in their hair, and a look in their eyes like they had seen something extraordinary, which they had. Alara watched all of this, from the places where she stood, without being asked to leave, but also without being asked to stay. When she was 9 years old, a boy named Owen Birch, the alpha's son, 2 years older than her and very aware of it, told her during a meal at the pack house that she was less than a wolf and more than a human, and that this meant she was nothing at all. He said it in front of 8 other children. He said it pleasantly, the way someone states a fact about the weather. Then he ate his food and moved on to another conversation. Alara did not cry, not then. She finished her food because she was hungry, and wasting food was something she had been taught never to do. She carried her bowl to the kitchen and washed it herself, even though that was not required of the children who ate at the pack house. Then she walked outside and sat behind the building, where no one could see her, and she cried for approximately 7 minutes. Then she wiped her face, stood up, and went back inside to help clear the remaining dishes, because no one else was doing it, and someone had to. This was what she did. She found the thing that needed to be done, and she did it. It was not a strategy she had invented. It was simply the shape her life had taken. When there was work, there was purpose, and when there was purpose, there was less time to sit with the particular loneliness that lived in her chest, like a stone she had long since stopped trying to remove. Her mother tried. Nora Voss was not a cold woman. She loved her daughter with the quiet, steady kind of love that does not announce itself but is always present. She brushed Ilara's hair every night, until Ilara was old enough to do it herself. She saved the best part of every meal for her. She read her stories in the evenings when the pack house had emptied out, and the two of them sat alone in the kitchen, with the lamp burning low. But Nora was also a woman, living inside a structure that did not allow her much space. Gareth Voss was not cruel to his wife. He was simply absent in the way that certain people are absent even when they are physically present. After the night of Ilara's birth, he had reorganized himself around the fact of his daughter, in the way he reorganized everything. Quietly, efficiently, without discussion. He did not mistreat her. He provided for her. He did not see her in any way that cost him anything. Ilara understood this by the time she was 10. Understanding it did not make it simpler. It simply made it known. She found Maren by accident. She had been running an errand for Clara, delivering a small package of dried herbs to a cottage at the edge of the Ashwood territory, the kind of errand given to children considered capable of following a path without getting distracted. Ilara was 8 years old and considered extremely capable, not as a compliment, but as a convenience. The cottage sat just inside the tree line, where the Ashwood border markers stood, and the woman who opened the door was old in a way that Ilara had never seen before. Not frail old. Old in the way that certain trees are old, dense and deep, and entirely unconcerned with what you thought of them. Maren took the package. She looked at Ilara. Then she said, without preamble, "Come inside and have something warm." Ilara should have gone straight back. She went inside. The cottage was filled with things, jars and bundles and hanging plants, and stacks of old books and maps pinned flat against the walls with small stones. It smelled like earth and herbs, and something else underneath that Ilara could not identify, something that reminded her of the smell right before it rained. She sat at the small table, and Maren put a cup of something in front of her that was warm and slightly sweet, and tasted like no tea she had ever had before. They did not talk much that first visit. Maren asked her name, her age, and whether she ate enough vegetables. Ilara answered all 3 questions honestly. When she stood up to leave, Maren said, "Come again when you have time." Ilara came again the following week, and the week after that. It became a pattern so gradual, she could not have said exactly when it became a habit. Maren never fussed over her. She never looked at Ilara with the particular expression that most adults used around her, that combination of discomfort and deflection. She looked at Ilara the way she looked at her books, and her maps, and her jars of plants, with attention, with a kind of recognition that Ilara had no words for, and did not try to name. Maren taught her things, not in the formal way of a classroom or a lesson. She would be doing something, grinding something in a stone bowl, copying a line from a book, studying a map, and she would explain what she was doing in a plain, direct way, as though Ilara were simply there and interested, which Ilara was. She learned the names of plants and what they were useful for. She learned how to read old script, the kind that no one in the pack used anymore but that appeared in the oldest record books. She learned how to read a map not just for direction but for history, for the places where borders had shifted and the reasons they had shifted. She learned to ask questions without apologizing for asking them. At the pack house, questions from Ilara were tolerated if they were practical, and ignored if they were anything else. With Maren, questions were expected. Maren answered them directly, and if she did not know the answer she said so, which was something Ilara had never heard any adult in her pack do before. By the time Ilara was 12, she was spending 2 afternoons a week at the cottage. She never told anyone about these visits, not because she was hiding them, but because she could not think of a single person who would want to hear about them, and she had developed a very precise sense of which things were worth sharing, and which things were better kept. Her visits with Maren fell into the second category. Not because they were secret, but because they were hers. The pack had a word for girls like Alara. Not the word Owen Birch had used, which was blunt and unkind. The word the adults used was quieter than that. They called her practical. They said it as if it were almost a compliment, and perhaps they meant it that way. But Alara understood that what they meant was that she was useful and manageable and unlikely to cause disruption. She had the kind of quietness that made people comfortable. She took up very little space. She made no demands. She was 13 when she first truly understood what being wolfless meant in the long term. A girl from another pack came to visit with her parents for a territorial meeting, and she and Alara spent an afternoon together near the training field, watching the older wolves run drills. The girl's name was Penny, and she was friendly in a careless way that some people are. Not unkind, just entirely unaware of the difference between herself and the person she was talking to. Penny asked Alara what rank she was going to hold when she was older. The question came the way all the questions from people like Penny came, easily, casually, as if the answer were obvious. Alara said, simply, that she did not know. Penny looked at her for a moment. But you must have some idea. You must know if you'll train as a warrior, or a healer, or a scout, or a... I don't have a wolf, Alara said. Penny went quiet. It was not a mean quiet. It was the quiet of someone who had genuinely never considered this as a possibility before. After a moment she said, "Oh, what happens then?" Alara looked at the training field, where the older wolves moved in practiced formations, fast and certain, and completely at home in their own bodies.
"I'm not sure," she said. "I suppose I figure out what is needed, and I do it." Penny seemed to find this a reasonable answer, and moved on to another topic.
Alara stayed on it for a long time after. The years that followed were neither terrible nor good. They were the years of a life lived along the edges of things, useful but not celebrated, present but not included, tolerated because she was capable and quiet, and never asked for more than she was given. She learned to cook well because the pack house needed cooks, and it was something she could do better than almost anyone without requiring a wolf to do it. She carried and cleaned and repaired and organized. She watched. She watched everything. She watched how the pack worked, how its power moved from person to person, how decisions were actually made, as opposed to how they were announced to be made. She watched which people held genuine influence, and which people held the appearance of influence. She watched which rules were enforced, and which rules were flexible depending on who was asking. She stored all of this the way she stored everything Marin taught her. Carefully, without obvious purpose, in the part of her mind she kept organized and private. She did not know, in those years, what any of it was for. She did not know that she was preparing for something. She was simply doing what she had always done, paying attention, because attention was the only tool she had never been told she was not allowed to use. On the night of her 19th birthday, she sat alone in the kitchen after the rest of the pack house had gone to sleep. She made herself a cup of tea, and sat at the table with the lamp burning low, and she looked at her own hands. They were calloused from years of work. They were steady. They were not beautiful hands in the way that some people had beautiful hands, but they were hers, and they were capable, and she had learned to value capability over almost everything else. She thought about the future the same way she always did, practically, without letting herself want things that seemed too far away to reach. She would work. She would save. She would build something small and her own. This was the plan. It was not an exciting plan. It was a plan for a person who had learned very early that the safest dreams were the ones that required nothing from anyone else. She did not know that 3 days later, everything was going to change. She did not know that a decree would come from somewhere far above her world and pull her out of the kitchen and into something she had no frame for. She did not know that the thing she had carried inside her without knowing it, the thing that had been silent and still inside her chest for 19 years, was about to make itself known in a way that would not allow anyone, including herself, to look away. She finished her tea. She rinsed the cup. She went to bed. And the night outside was quiet, and the moon was high, and somewhere in the very deep and private center of her, something that had been asleep for 19 years, shifted in its long sleep and turned over, the way a person turns in the night, just before waking. The decree arrived on a Tuesday morning, which was the most ordinary kind of morning the Ashwood pack ever had. Tuesdays meant bread delivery from the town bakery, which Alara signed for and stacked in the kitchen pantry before most of the pack house was awake. Tuesdays meant the weekly accounts needed updating, which the pack secretary, a distracted man named Fletcher, consistently forgot to do, until Alara reminded him. Tuesdays meant the young trainees came through the kitchen, demanding food at irregular hours, because their schedule shifted on training days, and Alara had learned to keep a pot warm on the back of the stove from the early morning onward. She was stirring that pot when Fletcher came into the kitchen holding a sealed document like it was something that might bite him. "There's an official summons," he said, "from the King's Court." Alara did not stop stirring. "Put it on the table. The Alpha will want it when he's done with his morning meeting. It is addressed to the pack officially. All packs received the same notice." Fletcher set it on the table but did not leave. He stood there in the way people stood when they were trying to decide whether to say the next thing. "It concerns all unmated females of age. For the summit." Alara stopped stirring then. She looked at the sealed document on the table. The wax seal was deep blue, pressed with the emblem of the Dravon crown, a wolf's head above crossed swords, the symbol that appeared on the official communication of the Alpha King's Court, and nowhere else. She had seen it before in the old books Marin had shown her, usually in the context of historical decrees that had reshaped territorial law across multiple generations. "All unmated females," she said, "of a certain age, 19 to 25. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "You fall within that range." Alara looked at the pot. She turned the heat down so nothing would burn while she was thinking. Then she picked up the sealed document, turned it over in her hands once, and set it back down. "The Alpha will handle the details," she said. Fletcher left. Alara went back to the pot. The Dominant Summit was not a new tradition. It happened every 5 years, and had been happening for longer than anyone currently alive could remember. It was the formal gathering of all pack leaders under the authority of the Alpha King, and it covered territorial agreements, resource negotiations, and whatever specific agenda the King's Court had added to the program for that cycle. Most of the time it was administrative. Most of the time, for anyone below the rank of Beta, it was entirely irrelevant. The addition to this cycle's agenda was new, and by midday the entire pack house was talking about it. Alara heard it in pieces the way she heard most things, while she was doing something else, in the margins of other people's conversations. The Alpha King, Kalen Draven, had been without a chosen partner since he took the throne at 17. 9 years of rejection. 9 years of presented females from across the packs returning to their homes with nothing. The court, apparently, had decided that the scope of the selection needed to expand. Every eligible female, not just those from the top-ranking packs, was to appear. "Every pack," said one of the senior warriors, Donald Hatch, while eating at the kitchen table. He was talking to another warrior, not to Alara, which meant Alara heard the whole thing while cleaning around them. "Not just the high packs, every pack. Can you imagine? We'll have wolfless girls from the outer territories showing up like they have any business being there." The other warrior laughed. Alara stacked plates. The pack meeting that evening was compulsory. Alara stood at the back. The Alpha, a large man named Rowan Hatch, Donald's uncle, which said a great deal about how decisions in the Ashwood pack got made, read the decree aloud with his usual combination of authority and mild irritation at having to do things he had not personally chosen to do. All eligible females were to be listed and submitted to the summit registry. Attendance was mandatory under territorial law. Failure to comply carried formal sanctions against the pack. After the meeting, Alara's father found her near the kitchen doorway. He said nothing for a moment. He had a particular silence when he was deciding which version of a thing to say. "You are within the age range," he said finally. "I know. The Alpha has asked me to submit the pack's list to the registry by the end of the week." "I assumed so." Gareth looked at her with the expression he used when he was calculating something. Not calculating how to help her. Calculating how to manage a situation. "I am going to speak with the Alpha about whether your name needs to be included, given your particular circumstances." Alara understood what her particular circumstances meant. She had been understanding what it meant for 19 years. "Do what you think is right," she said, and went back into the kitchen. What Gareth did, she found out later, was speak privately with the Alpha about the awkwardness of presenting a wolfless daughter at a royal summit. Rowan listened. Rowan agreed it was awkward. Rowan intended to handle it quietly, and then the pack elder, a thin and particular woman named Agnes Fern who had disliked Gareth Voss for 15 years, over a territorial boundary dispute, submitted the full pack list to the summit registry before the Alpha's adjusted list could be sent. Every female of age, including Alara. Alara found out about this from Clara, who found it mildly satisfying in the private way that healers sometimes found things satisfying. Agnes sent it herself, Clara said, not quite hiding a small smile. The registry is now closed. The list cannot be amended. Alara absorbed this for a moment. So I am going. You are going, Clara confirmed. Alara nodded once and went back to the bread she was slicing. The practical arrangements for the summit took 2 weeks to organize. The pack was sending 4 females officially. The Alpha's niece, Lena Hatch, who was 20 and confident and had spent most of the past year preparing for exactly this kind of event. 2 daughters from senior warrior families, and Alara. The contrast was not subtle. Lena had a wardrobe assembled specifically for the trip. The other 2 had purchased new dresses in the town market. Alara had her best everyday dress, which was clean and well kept, but was clearly an everyday dress. Nobody said anything about this directly. The silence around it had the particular texture of something everyone noticed, and nobody wanted to manage. 2 days before they were scheduled to leave, Alara went to Marin's cottage. The old woman was outside when she arrived, kneeling in her garden with her hands in the soil, doing something with a plant that looked complicated. She did not look up when Alara came through the gate, which was Marin's way of acknowledging someone's presence, without performing a welcome she had not been asked for. Alara sat on the low stone wall that ran along the garden path and waited. After a while, Marin stood, brushed the dirt from her hands, and sat in the old wooden chair near the cottage door. She looked at Alara with eyes that were both very old and very sharp, the kind of eyes that had been watching things for so long they had stopped needing to look hard. You know about the summit, Alara said. I know about most things, Marin said. I'm going. Alara paused. I didn't choose to go, but I'm going. Marin said nothing. She was quiet, in a specific way. Not the quiet of someone with nothing to say, but the quiet of someone deciding how much to say. I know you well enough to know when you are deciding something, Alara said. It was the most direct thing she had ever said to the old woman about her habits, and she said it gently. Marin looked at her for a moment. Then she got up and went inside without a word, and Alara waited because she had learned that Marin's movements always meant something. She came back out carrying a small glass vial. It was sealed with dark wax, and fit easily into the palm of her hand. Inside it, through the glass, the liquid moved with a faint shimmer that was not quite like anything Alara had seen before. Not gold, not white. A silver that seemed to carry its own very faint light. Marin held it out. Alara looked at it for a long moment before she took it. What is it? She asked. Something that belongs to you, Marin said. Alara turned the vial carefully in her fingers. The liquid moved inside it with a slow, almost deliberate heaviness that did not match its small size. It felt oddly warm through the glass. That does not answer my question. No, Marin agreed, it does not. Alara looked up. Then give me a better answer. Marin was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to become a decision. It is something that has been kept safe until the right time. That is all I can tell you now. What I can tell you clearly is this. Do not open it. Keep it with you, but do not open it unless you have no other option. Unless you are at your absolute end and you have nothing else left. That is a very dramatic instruction for something you say belongs to me. Yes, Marin said simply. It is. Alara looked at the vial. She looked at Marin. In 11 years of knowing this woman, she had never been given information without it eventually proving to be exactly correct. Marin did not embellish. Marin did not speculate. Every single thing she had ever told Alara had turned out to be precisely what it was described to be. She tucked the vial into the inside pocket of her jacket, close to her body, where it sat with a warmth that felt less like temperature, and more like something else she did not have a word for. Is there anything else you want to tell me? She asked. Yes, Marin said. Do not be afraid of yourself. Alara waited for more. Nothing more came. She stood, said a quiet goodbye, and walked back through the gate. She did not look back, but she felt the old woman's eyes on her until the tree line closed between them. The morning they departed, the pack gathered in the main yard to see the 4 females off. It was a formal send-off, not warm exactly, but organized in the way that the Ashwood pack organized everything, with a clear line between those who mattered to the occasion and those who were present as background. Lena Hatch stood at the center with her family around her, and there was a lot of quiet discussion about the specific blue of her dress and whether it suited her eyes. The other two girls stood nearby, close enough to benefit from the reflected attention, without being bold enough to claim any for themselves. Ilara stood slightly apart. She had her bag, which was practical and sufficient. She had her everyday dress under her traveling coat. She had the vial in her inside pocket. She was ready in the way she was always ready, not for any specific outcome, but for the work of being present. Nobody spoke to her directly before they left. Her father shook hands with the alpha and spoke briefly about pack business. Her mother found her near the edge of the yard and took her hand and held it for a moment without saying anything, which said more than most words could have. Ilara squeezed her hand back. The coach left in the mid-morning. Lena talked about the summit for the first 2 hours. The other two girls contributed enthusiastically. Ilara sat near the window and watched the territory change outside, the ashwood forests giving way to open ground, then to roads that carried more traffic as they moved further from the territory borders and closer to the central lands where the summit was held. She thought about what Marin had said. She thought about it in the precise, systematic way she thought about most things, turning it over, examining it from different angles, filing it in the correct place inside her mind. Do not open it unless you have no other option. She did not know what that meant yet. She did not know what kind of situation would count as having no other option. She had very limited experience with situations like that. Her entire life had been built on finding options, on locating the available action and taking it, on making something out of whatever was provided. But Marin had never been wrong about anything, and the vial in her pocket was warm against her chest, like something alive, something patient, something that had been waiting a very long time. The summit grounds came into view in the late afternoon, on the second day of travel. Even from a distance, they were impressive in the particular way that things built to impress are impressive, large, orderly, surrounded by flags, carrying the emblems of dozens of packs spread across the territory. The main building was stone, old stone that had been cleaned and maintained over generations, with wide steps leading up to broad doors that stood open to receive the arriving delegations. Hundreds of people moved around the grounds, pack leaders and their entourages, court officials with scrolls and lists, guards in the formal uniform of the king's personal battalion, servants managing the logistics of feeding and housing a gathering of this size, and females, girls and women from every pack in the territory, some in groups, some in small pairs, some alone, all within the specified age range, all registered and catalogued, and waiting for something that none of them could fully predict. Ilara climbed down from the coach and stood with her bag at her side. She looked at the summit grounds with the same calm attention she gave to everything, taking in the details, noting the layout, identifying the practical patterns in how things were organized. Lena was already straightening her dress and looking toward the main building with her chin slightly lifted. The other two were pulling their bags from the coach with excited nervousness that expressed itself in small, quick movements. A court official approached their group with a scroll. "Ashwood Pack?" "Yes," Lena said immediately. 4 registered females. The official looked at his list. Lena Hatch, Bess Fuller, Claire Dowd, and... He paused, looked again. Ilara Voss. "Present," Ilara said. The official looked up at her. He did not say anything. He made a small mark on his scroll, with the particular movement of someone noting something unexpected, and choosing to keep that note private. Then he moved on to the next group. Ilara picked up her bag and followed the others toward the main building. Whatever was waiting for her inside had been waiting. She understood somewhere very deep and very quiet, for a very long time. She did not know its shape yet. She did not know its name. She only knew that the vial in her pocket was warmer than before, and that she had 11 years of a strange woman's reliable wisdom telling her to carry it carefully. She carried it carefully. She walked up the wide stone steps with the same steady, unhurried pace she used for everything, and she did not look back at the road she had come from, because she had learned very young that looking back at roads did not change where you were going. The doors were wide, and the hall beyond them was full and loud, and somewhere inside all of that, something was already in motion that she had not yet seen. Kalen Draven had not wanted this summit edition. He had made that very clear to his court 3 months before, in the kind of quiet, certain tone that his advisors had learned to receive without argument, even when they disagreed completely. He sat in his private study the evening before the summit formally opened, reading through the registry of registered females, not because he wanted to, but because his chief advisor, a methodical man named Stuart Cole, had presented it to him, with the reasoning that it was better to be prepared than surprised, and Kalen was not a man who enjoyed being surprised. The registry was long, hundreds of names from across the territory, organized by pack and rank. He read through the first several pages, with the same expression he used for financial reports and territorial maps. Focused, clinical, entirely absent of anything that could be called anticipation. He had been rejecting women presented to him for 5 years, not out of cruelty, or not entirely out of cruelty, his advisors sometimes thought privately, but out of a particular and deeply inconvenient standard that he had never explicitly defined to anyone, including himself. He knew what he was looking for in the way that you sometimes know a specific taste without being able to describe it to someone who has never tasted it, and he had not found it in 5 years of looking. The court was patient. The territory needed an heir. The patience was beginning to develop edges. This was why Stuart had pushed for the expanded Summit edition. This was why the court had drafted the decree and sent it to all packs without waiting for Kalen to formally approve it, which was technically outside their authority, and which Kalen had chosen not to address because the result, a wider net, was practically logical, even if the method was politically presumptuous. He read through the lower-ranking pack listings. He was nearly at the end of the document when the name caught his eye. Not because of anything about the name itself, because of what was missing next to it. In the registry column marked Wolf Name, every single entry had a second name. Every single one. Hundreds of females, every one of them, with the 2-part name that marked them as full members of their packs and their lineage. Every one except one. Elara Voss. Ashwood Pack. Beta family. Age 19. Wolf name. None registered. Kalen looked at this for a moment. He read the notation that accompanied her entry, which the Summit registrar had added because the situation was unusual enough to warrant it. Female included, per full pack submission by Elder Agnes Fern. Classification, no inner wolf confirmed, attending as registered per decree. He set down the document. He picked up his tea. He set down his tea. He picked up the document again and read the entry one more time. He did not say anything to Stuart about it that evening. He went to bed at a reasonable hour, slept for exactly 6 hours, and rose before the sun to run the perimeter of the Summit grounds alone, which he did every morning regardless of location, because the first hour of every day belonged to him, and he was not willing to negotiate that. He thought about the entry while he ran. He could not have explained why it interested him. He was not a man who found himself interested in things he could not explain, which made this mildly irritating. He ran faster and thought less, which was the reliable solution to most things that irritated him about himself. The Summit opened formally at 10 in the morning, with the territorial proceedings, the pack leaders filing into the main hall, in order of their standing, the court officials organizing the agenda, the administrative sessions that would run for most of the first 2 days before the presentation of females began. Kalen sat through all of it with professional attention. He had mastered the art of being completely present in a room, while keeping a specific part of his mind entirely private, and he exercised this art now. Around him, the court moved with practiced efficiency. His beta, a sharp and unreadable man named Leon Marsh, managed the room with minimal visible effort. His legal advisor handled the territorial dispute from the Eastern Pack that had been bubbling for months. His chief financial officer presented the updated levy structure to the assembled pack leaders, most of whom objected to something, which was always the case, and which the financial officer always resolved with the same combination of immovable patience and mathematical certainty. Kalen listened, decided, signed, approved, and declined, across 2 days of sessions, with the focused efficiency that had become his reputation, and that he worked to maintain, not for the impression it made, but because inefficiency genuinely bothered him, at a level that was almost physical. On the 3rd morning, the formal presentations began. The hall was arranged for it, the long central floor cleared, the pack leaders seated on one side, the court counsel on the other, and Kalen's throne, placed at the head of the room, in a position that was deliberately elevated to create the specific dynamic that his court felt was necessary, and that he personally found mildly theatrical, but had accepted as a practical reality. The females were brought in by pack groups, introduced formally by the court secretary, and given a brief audience. He was honest with himself about what he was doing. He was looking for something. He did not know if the something existed. He had been looking for 5 years. The most useful thing he could do, he had decided, was remain open without being optimistic, because optimism was a position that required maintenance, and he did not want to spend energy on maintenance. The Ashwood group came in near midday. They were 4. They walked in the order that the court secretary indicated. Lena Hatch was first, tall, composed, clearly prepared, wearing the kind of dress that announces itself before its wearer does. She introduced herself with a practiced confidence that Kaylin recognized as the specific confidence of someone who had been told their whole life that they were likely to succeed at things and had organized their entire presentation around making that expectation visible. He studied her for a moment, thanked her politely, and moved on. The next 2 were less memorable, not through any fault of their own, but because they were standing in the shadow of both the one before them and the one after them. And sometimes, the position you stand in says more about where you are in a system than who you actually are. Then the last one. She walked to the center of the floor with the particular kind of quiet that is not shyness. Kaylin knew shyness, and this was not it. Shyness looked inward and tried to be smaller. This was something different. This was a person who had learned to be still inside herself, in a way that had nothing to do with the room she was standing in. She stood in the center of the floor, and she was simply present in a way that had no performance in it. She looked at him directly, which was not unusual. Most of the females looked directly at him, because they were trying to make a specific impression. She did not look at him like that. She looked at him the way she had probably looked at things her whole life. With attention, with that particular careful quality he had noticed in himself, and only very occasionally in others, as though she was seeing what was actually there, rather than what she had decided to see before she arrived. He noted the absence of a wolf name. He noted the calloused hands that said more about her daily life than any formal introduction could. He noted the jacket, which was practical and clean, but was clearly a working jacket rather than a presentation jacket, and the fact that this seemed entirely intentional rather than overlooked. His beta leaned over and said, very quietly, "The registry note. This is the wolfless one." Kaylin made no indication that he had heard this. The court secretary cleared his throat, with the energy of someone preparing to make a formal announcement about a situation that was somewhat uncomfortable. "This is Alara Voss, daughter of Beta Gareth Voss of the Ashwood Pack. She is..." From the pack leader's side of the room, one of the senior leaders, Marcus Fell from the Stonegate Pack, a man who had an enormous amount of territory and a very limited supply of discretion, spoke over the introduction in a carrying voice. "She has no wolf. She should not be standing there." Several people reacted in small ways. Some of the council members exchanged looks. Several of the pack leaders shifted in their seats, with the discomfort of people watching something awkward happen and being uncertain whether to pretend it was not happening. Alara did not move. She did not flinch. She stood in the center of the floor, and her expression did not change, which was impressive, because changing expression in response to public dismissal was an extremely natural human reaction. She simply waited, with that same steady stillness, as if the comment had been made about someone in another room. Kaylin raised his right hand, flat, palm down. It was a very small gesture. It stopped every sound in the room immediately. He looked at Marcus Fell for exactly 3 seconds. It was not a long look, but it was a specific look, the kind that came from 9 years of being the person whose silence everyone waited for, and Marcus Fell understood it correctly and sat back. Kaylin looked at Alara. She was still looking at him, not challenging, not performing patience, just present. He was aware of something he rarely felt in formal settings, a kind of sharpened attention that arrived when something genuinely interested him, rather than just requiring him. It arrived now, and he noted it the way he noted all things about himself, practically, without over-interpreting. "Your name is Alara Voss," he said. "Yes," she said. Her voice was even. Not loud, not soft. Exactly sufficient for the room. He looked at her for another moment. "Thank you," he said, which was what he said to everyone, and meant by it exactly what he always meant, the practical acknowledgement of time given and received. Then he looked at the court secretary and gave the very slight inclination of his head that meant, "Next group." Alara walked back to the side of the hall without hurrying. She found a position near the wall, and stood there with her hands folded in front of her, and her face turned toward the room, in the manner of someone who intended to remain attentive for as long as was necessary. Kalen continued through the presentations. But the thing that had sharpened inside him did not go away. It sat at the back of his attention, like a note written in the margin of a document. Small, specific, impossible to pretend, had not been written. He had seen hundreds of females over 5 years. He had been looking for something without knowing its exact shape. He had not expected that the thing which most closely resembled the shape he was looking for would walk into his hall wearing a working jacket and carrying no wolf name and no visible expectation that the world was going to behave well toward her. He did not act on this. He was not a man who acted on things before he understood them. He finished the day's presentations, conducted the afternoon's territorial session, ate dinner with his senior counsel, and excused himself at a reasonable hour. Leon Marsh found him on the balcony an hour later. "You are thinking about her," Leon said. This was why Kalen kept Leon close. He was one of perhaps 3 people in the world who could say something like that without Kalen experiencing the immediate instinct to dismiss it. "I am thinking about the registration entry," Kalen said. "Which entry?" "The wolfless one." Leon was quiet for a moment. "She is from a beta family. She has no wolf. She has no standing in any formal sense. There would be considerable resistance from the council." "I did not ask for your assessment of the political landscape." "You did not have to," Leon said. "That is why you keep me around." Kalen looked out over the summit grounds, where the evening had settled everything into a kind of organized quiet. Lights from 100 different lodgings, the sound of a territory that had gathered itself together under one roof for the first time in 5 years. "Pull the historical files," he said. "Which historical files?" "Any records pertaining to unusual bloodlines. The oldest we have access to, the ones that have not been opened in at least a generation." He paused. "Tonight." Leon looked at him for a moment, with the expression of a man who was very good at his work and was currently computing how much of that work was about to increase significantly. Then he said, "Yes, Alpha King," and went to find the archivist. Kalen stayed on the balcony a while longer. He was not given to feelings that he could not justify with evidence. He had run his reign, and before that his life, on the principle that what could not be supported by reason was probably not worth following. But there was something about the way she had stood in the center of that floor, steady, still, looking at everything with those careful eyes, that had touched something in him that was very old and very specific. He could not name it yet. He was patient enough to wait until he could. Below, the lights burned on, and the summit grounds hummed with the particular energy of many lives gathered in one place. And somewhere in one of the registered lodgings, he knew, a young woman was sitting very quietly, and probably not sleeping, carrying something inside her that she did not yet know the name of. He did not know why he was certain of this. He was certain of it anyway. The archivist, Percy Vane, arrived at the records room at 11 that night to find Leon Marsh already there, sitting at the wide table with a lantern and a cup of cold tea, and the focused expression of a man who had skipped dinner for the 3rd time that week. Percy set down his own lamp without comment, because he had worked with Leon long enough to understand that commenting on his habits was not a productive use of either of their time. Leon had already identified 3 of the relevant document categories from the index before Percy arrived. The indices were old themselves, hand-copied in the style used before the current court's record-keeping standardization, with a system of cross-referencing that was not intuitive unless you understood the logic behind it, which required understanding the mind of the archivist who had organized it 3 generations prior. Percy understood that mind. He had spent 20 years thinking inside the same frameworks. He recognized the particular way certain entries had been organized to look like medical records when they were actually lineage classifications, because the person who had filed them had been trying to preserve information while making it invisible to casual scrutiny. He recognized the small code embedded in the section numbering, that was not a code at all in the conventional sense, but was rather a consistency of placement that would mean nothing to someone not already looking for it. He found the primary bloodline documents in the section listed as ancestral health records, which had not been opened in the current archival period, 30 years of Percy's tenure, at all. The spine of the folder was clean, where the others were worn at the edges. He laid the documents on the table, and Leon looked at them, and then they read them side by side, in silence for a while, each of them coming to the same conclusions from different directions, and occasionally, One of them would say a word or a page number, and the other would nod, because the word or the page number was sufficient. At midnight, Leon said, "Pull everything that connects to this, every cross-reference, every secondary document." Percy was already doing so. He had 4 additional folders open on the table, and a 5th one coming. "The scope of this is larger than I initially expected," he said, which for Percy was the equivalent of saying the scope was enormous. "Yes," Leon said. "The Alpha King needs to see this tonight," Percy said. "Yes," Leon said again. He was already standing. They brought Kalen down to the records room at 1:45 in the morning. He arrived in exactly the same clothes he had been wearing earlier, which meant he had not been sleeping either. He sat at the table and he read. He did not speak while he read. He turned pages with careful deliberateness, and Percy noticed that he moved through the old script as though he could read it without the transcript, which turned out to be true. Kalen Dravon, who had conducted himself like a man who had been running a kingdom since he was a teenager and had read everything relevant to doing so, had at some point learned to read at least 2 of the old script styles currently sitting on the table. He read for 45 minutes, then he sat back. "Who else has access to these records?" he said. "Officially, only court archivists and the senior counsel," Percy said. "In practice, this section has not been accessed in 30 years. "And the suppression, the mechanism of it." Kalen looked at a specific page. "This preparation given to newborns, is it still in practice?" Percy and Leon looked at each other. "I cannot confirm either way from these documents," Percy said carefully. "But the absence of new silver blood carriers from any record in the last 3 generations suggests the practice or something equivalent to it has continued." Kalen looked at the page for another moment. He stood up. "Prepare a formal summary," he said to Percy. "Cross-referenced, sourced, complete. I want it before the morning session." He looked at Leon. "I want the Ashwood Pack's entry pulled and reviewed, tonight." He walked out. The lanterns flickered once in the draft of the closing door. Percy looked at his remaining folders and calculated, very approximately, how many hours of sleep he was going to get. The number was not large. He picked up his pen anyway. The lodging assigned to the Ashwood Pack females was a long, narrow room, with 4 narrow beds, and 1 window that faced the courtyard. It was a practical room, which Alara appreciated, because practical rooms required nothing of you except that you use them correctly. Lena Hatch claimed the bed nearest the window immediately upon arriving. This was predictable, and Alara had expected it, and had already identified the bed nearest the door as the one she would take, which was less desirable by most measures. It was farthest from the light, and directly in the draft when the door opened, but which suited her perfectly, because it was the one that gave her the clearest view of the room upon waking, which was a habit she had developed without quite intending to. She unpacked her bag with the efficiency of someone who had learned to organize small spaces very well. She folded things, arranged them, created a system. She was aware of the other 3 girls talking, mostly Lena talking, the other 2 responding, and she processed the conversation with one part of her attention, while the rest of her thought about the day. She thought about the court hall. She thought about the moment Marcus Fell had spoken over the introduction. She thought about what it felt like to stand in the center of a room full of people who were waiting for you to be embarrassed, and to simply not be. She had done that for 19 years in smaller rooms. The only difference today was the audience. She thought about the Alpha King. She thought about him carefully, the way she thought about things that required precision. He was younger than she had expected, though she had not allowed herself expectations either way. He had the kind of face that was not conventionally handsome, but was completely commanding. The features were strong, and the eyes were extraordinary, the gray of deep water before a storm, and they moved across a room with the quality of eyes that missed very little. She had noticed that he tracked movement with the specific attention of someone who processed information visually first and verbally second, which was a trait she recognized because it was one of her own. She had also noticed that when Marcus Fell made his comment, the Alpha King's right hand had moved. Just slightly. Just briefly. A tension in the fingers that was gone before most people would have registered it. She did not know what to do with that observation. She filed it in the part of her mind designated for things that were interesting and not yet useful. The vial was still in her jacket pocket. She took the jacket off carefully and folded it with the vial still inside, and placed it at the bottom of her small pile of belongings, where it would be against her back when she lay down. She did not fully understand why she wanted to keep it close. She understood that she did, and she had learned to trust the difference between the things her mind understood and the things her body knew. The evening meal was taken in the main dining hall, a massive room that had been organized into long tables by pack grouping. It was loud, in the way that rooms full of people with competing agendas are always loud. Everyone's conversation slightly elevated to be heard over everyone else's. Ilara ate her food and listened to 3 different conversations at once, which was a skill she had developed in the pack house kitchen, and which she had never found a way to properly explain to anyone who did not already do it. At the table across from the Ashwood group sat a girl named Wren Cole, from the Hillside Pack. Ilara noticed her because she was doing something similar, eating quietly, looking at everything, not performing for anyone. Their eyes met once across the table, and Wren gave a very small nod, the kind that acknowledges another person without demanding anything from them. Ilara gave one back. That was the entirety of that interaction. It was the most genuinely comfortable moment Ilara had at the evening meal. After dinner, Lena and the other 2 went to a gathering that several of the higher-ranking pack females had organized in one of the common rooms. Ilara went back to the lodging room and sat on her bed with her back against the wall and the vial resting in her palm. She looked at it in the low lamplight. The shimmer inside it was subtle. You would miss it if you were not looking carefully. It moved the way heat moves off stone on a summer day. Not dramatic, not urgent, just continuously and without ceasing. Do not open it unless you are at your absolute end. She turned the vial over once. Then she put it back in her jacket pocket, turned off the lamp, and lay down. She did not sleep quickly. She lay in the dark and thought about Marin. She thought about the way Marin had held the vial out to her, not dramatically, but with the kind of steadiness that comes from having waited a long time for something, and finally arriving at the moment of it. She thought about the particular weight of Marin's instruction. Do not be afraid of yourself. She had spent 19 years being not afraid of herself in the specific way that people who have nothing to be afraid of are not afraid. She was wolfless. She had never had anything inside her to fear. The other children were afraid sometimes of their wolves, of the strength of them, of the suddenness, of what it felt like to have something wild living inside a human body. She had envied that fear. Even the fear seemed like a privilege. She wondered, in the dark, what Marin had meant. The second day of presentations proceeded with the same organized efficiency as the first. More groups, more formal introductions, more of the particular atmosphere that settled over the hall when everyone in it was performing for one person, and that person was performing for no one at all. Ilara stood with the Ashwood group for the morning session, which was not when they were called. The afternoon session. She spent the morning observing the presentations from a position at the back of the hall. She had positioned herself there before the Ashwood group had settled, and none of them had asked her to move, partly because they did not particularly care where she stood. She watched Kalen Dravon work. She had the specific advantage of watching him in the way she watched most things, without a stake in his response to her, without any performance anxiety, without the particular distortion that came from wanting something from someone. She could simply see him. And what she saw was interesting. He was not enjoying this. That was the first thing. She could see it in the very precise absence of enjoyment on his face, which was not the same as displeasure. He was not displeased. He was simply doing something that was necessary, and doing it with complete professionalism, and without any pretense that it was something other than what it was. She found this honest in a way that surprised her, because she had assumed that someone with his kind of power would have long since mastered the art of performing feelings he did not have. He seemed unwilling to do that, or possibly incapable of it. She also noticed something she had not noticed in the hall during the first day's presentation, because she had been in the center of the room, and her vantage point had been limited. She noticed that he looked at each female who stood before him with genuine attention, not romantic attention, not the glazed patience of someone waiting to get through an obligation, actual attention, the same kind of focused looking she used on problems she was trying to solve. He was looking for something. She filed this away too. It joined the note about his right hand. The summit grounds had a large garden area at the eastern side that had been set up with tables and chairs for the assembled guests to use between sessions. On the afternoon of the third day, Ilara walked through it alone. She did this partly because she needed to move after a morning of standing, and partly because she thought better when she was moving, and she needed to think. She had been at the summit for 3 days, and she was beginning to understand something about the situation that had been less clear to her before she arrived. She had come here assuming she was irrelevant to the purpose of the gathering, a clerical accident, included through a technicality, present but essentially invisible in the formal sense. And in the formal sense, that was true. She was wolfless. She had no rank, she had no power, she had no meaningful future in pack society, as it was currently structured. But she was observant, and what she was observing was that the gathering was more complicated than its formal purpose suggested. There were 3 distinct groups of pack leaders whose behavior toward Kalen Dravon's council was not quite what the formal record of their positions would suggest. There were 2 minor territorial disputes quietly boiling beneath the surface of the official sessions. There was a particular tension in the way Kalen's chief financial officer interacted with the Stonegate Pack's representative, including Marcus Fell, who had dismissed her in the presentation hall, that suggested a disagreement about the new levy structure that was significantly less settled than the official record of the morning's session had made it seem. She noticed these things the way she noticed everything, without searching for them, simply by being present and attentive in the way she had always been present and attentive. She was sitting at a table near the garden wall with a cup of tea, organizing her observations in her mind, when Ren Cole appeared at the adjacent table. The girl from Hillside Pack again. She sat down with her own tea and looked at Alara. "You were watching the whole room all morning," Ren said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation. "I usually do," Alara said. Ren nodded, as though this made perfect sense. "I do too. Most people think I'm daydreaming." She paused. "What did you see?" It was such a direct question that Alara almost laughed. She appreciated it. The Stonegate representative is unhappy about something specific in the levy revision. He has been signaling to at least 2 other pack leaders all morning. The Eastern Pack dispute is not really about the border they are officially arguing about. There is something underneath it, and the Alpha King's chief advisor is tracking those 3 pack leaders in the corner very carefully. Ren looked at her over her tea. "You got all of that from watching." "I have been watching things my whole life," Alara said. Ren was quiet for a moment, then, "I heard what Marcus Fell said to you in the presentation hall." "Most people heard it. You did not react." "Reacting in rooms like that gives people something to look at besides themselves," Alara said. "I prefer not to give them that." Ren studied her for a moment. She had the kind of eyes that were very dark and very steady, and she looked at Alara the way people looked at you when they were genuinely trying to see you, rather than the story they already had about you. "You are not what I expected from a beta family of the Ashwood Pack." "I am not what most people expect," Alara said. "I have stopped finding that surprising." They sat in the garden for another half hour, talking in the easy, direct way of 2 people who had discovered they operated similarly and found it something close to relief. Ren was from a warrior family in Hillside. She had a wolf that she described as headstrong and specific in its opinions, which she said with a dry humor that suggested the relationship between them was complicated but functional. She was at the summit because her pack was politically strategic, and the summit was a diplomatic exercise as much as anything else. She did not ask Alara directly about the wolfless situation. Alara noted this, and was grateful for it. When they parted to return to their respective lodgings before the evening session, Ren said, "I hope the rest of this goes well for you." She said it simply, without the particular quality some people gave to their good wishes when they secretly expected the opposite. "Thank you," Alara said. She meant it. She went back to her lodging room. She changed her jacket for the evening session's dress code, transferring the vial carefully from one pocket to the other as she did. She stood at the window for a moment before leaving. The summit grounds were lit now in the early evening, torches along the paths, light in every window. 3 days in. Whatever was going to happen here, she was in the middle of it. She had not chosen to be here, but she had arrived, and she was present, and she was paying attention. This was all she knew how to do. This was, she had begun to suspect in the last few days, significantly more than most people knew how to do. She went to the evening session. She did not know, walking down the corridor toward the main hall, that she was less than 18 hours from the moment that would change everything. She did not know that what was sleeping inside her, the thing that had been there all along, the thing the world had told her did not exist, was within hours of waking, in a way that would not allow anyone in that building, or outside it, to pretend they had not seen it. She straightened her jacket. She walked into the hall. She found a position near the back where she could see everything. She paid attention. She returned to the lodging room that evening to find Lena Hatch already in bed, with the lamp off on her side, which meant Lena was either sleeping or pretending to sleep. And either way, Alara was not going to investigate. She changed quietly, tucked the vial under her pillow where she could feel it, and lay on her back in the dark. The room was not fully silent. She could hear the sounds of the building around her, the distant movement of people still awake in other corridors, the creak of old wood settling, the particular ambient quality of a structure housing many people at once. She was accustomed to sleeping in shared spaces. The pack house had never been particularly private. She had a long-practiced ability to separate the sounds she needed to respond to from the sounds she could let go, and she let most of these go. What she could not let go was the thinking. She thought about the session that morning, which was the fourth morning now, and what it had shown her about how decisions moved in Kalen Dravon's court. He made things clear, not performatively clear. He did not make speeches about clarity, or announce that he was about to be direct. He simply was direct, and the directness created a kind of efficiency in the room around him that she found unexpectedly easy to work inside. She had spent most of her life in environments where the most important information lived in the spaces between what was said, in the gap between the announced decision and the real one. She had learned to read those gaps. She was very good at it, but reading gaps was work, and working inside a system where the gap was minimal was something she had not had much experience with. She thought about Leon Marsh's question on her first evening here. How long have you been watching rooms the way you watch today? She had told him her whole life, which was true, but was not quite the full truth. The full truth was that she had been watching rooms that way because watching was the only form of participation available to her. You paid attention to what you could not touch. You learned to read what you could not enter. That condition was, as of this morning's session, formally in the process of changing. She was not yet certain what the change felt like from the inside. She was in the middle of it, which was the hardest place to take measurements. She thought about Ren Cole in the garden, who had said, "Most people think I am daydreaming." She thought about what it meant to find another person who worked the same way you did, who took in information systematically, who used silence as a tool rather than a failure, who was comfortable being in a room and not performing for it. She had not had many experiences of that particular recognition. She found, lying in the dark, that she wanted to have more of them. She thought about the vial under her pillow, warm through the fabric, that same persistent warmth that was not temperature exactly, but that she had stopped trying to categorize in physical terms. It was there. It had always been there, presumably. The warmth had always been there, carried inside her in a form so suppressed she had never registered it at all. She wondered what it had been like for the silver blood, if she could assign an experience to it, which she understood was not scientifically sound but which her imagination did anyway, to be dormant all those years. Waiting. She thought about waiting. She had spent her whole life doing it, not passively. Her waiting had always been active, filled with work and learning, and the precise maintenance of a steadiness she had built without a blueprint, but waiting nonetheless, for a space that was hers. For a room she was allowed to enter without apology, for the particular dignity of being seen accurately rather than being seen as a gap in the record. She had been waiting for 19 years, and she had not known, until this week, what she was waiting for. She had thought she was simply building a life out of what was available, one practical decision at a time. The discovery that she had been waiting for something real, something that had been there all along, was complicated in the way of finding something you had stopped looking for. She turned onto her side. She pressed her hand against the pillow and felt the warmth of the vial through the fabric and breathed slowly. Tomorrow was the fourth day, and something was going to happen. She did not know what. She knew it the way she knew most things, not through prophecy, but through the accumulation of specific observations that pointed, when organized correctly, in a particular direction. She let herself sleep. The evening session was not scheduled to include any additional presentations. It was meant to be a brief administrative review, outstanding matters from the day's territorial discussions, a formal dinner for the pack leaders and their ranking council members, and a closing address from the court secretary about the following day's schedule. Alara stood at the back of the hall, through the administrative section, watching. She watched Leon Marsh watch the room. She watched the three pack leaders in the corner conduct a quiet conversation they did not want the council to notice. She watched Kalen Dravan listen to his court secretary's closing address, with the specific quality of attention that meant he was present in the room, and thinking about something else simultaneously, which was a capacity she recognized and respected. What she did not expect was what happened after the formal session ended. The hall shifted from formal to semi-formal, with the particular organized fluidity of a well-run court. Chairs rearranging, conversation breaking out, the dinner tables being prepared in the adjacent room. Alara had been planning to return to the lodging room. She had no place at the dinner, which was for ranking members only, and she was tired in the particular way of someone who had been processing a great deal of information very carefully for 3 days without pause. She was moving toward the corridor that led back to the lodging block when she became aware that the 3 men she had been watching in the corner were now moving in the same direction she was moving. Not following her specifically, she did not believe they had noted her at all. They were simply going the same way, talking still in the low, private way they had been talking all evening. She slowed her pace. She was not doing this consciously. Her body did it first, and her mind caught up a moment later, processing the information her instincts had already registered. The 3 of them had moved ahead of her now, and turned left at the junction, which was toward the exterior garden path rather than toward the lodging block. She turned left too, maintaining a distance. She told herself she was not following them. She was going to the garden, because the corridor to the lodging block was crowded with people from the dinner preparation, and the garden path was less crowded. This was partially true, and partially a practical story she was telling herself, while doing something that her very precise sense of pattern recognition was telling her was relevant. They stopped near the stone wall at the far end of the garden. They were clearly certain they were alone. They were not loud, but they had stopped lowering their voices quite as much as they had in the hall, and Alara had found a bench along the garden wall that was in sufficient shadow and at sufficient proximity that she could hear them clearly, while being essentially invisible to anyone standing where they were standing. She identified 2 of the 3. Marcus Fell of Stonegate. She recognized his voice and his posture. The one beside him was the Crestwood Pack's senior elder, a man named Edwin Croft, whose presence at the summit was supposed to be purely administrative. The third she could not fully identify from where she sat. They were talking about the levy structure. They were talking about it in a way that was not the public language of formal objection, but the private language of organized resistance. They had numbers. They had specific figures. They had a proposal they were planning to present together to the council on the final morning of the summit, framed as a collective position from several packs, which they calculated would be difficult for the court to simply refuse. The proposal was not on the official agenda. It was designed to be introduced at the last possible moment, when there was insufficient time to analyze it before the summit formally closed. Alara sat very still and listened to all of it. She was not certain what the right thing to do with this information was. She turned that question over carefully while the 3 men finished their conversation and moved back toward the main building. She stayed on the bench for another few minutes, organizing what she had heard into a clear structure. The levy proposal, from what she understood of it, was not simply a financial objection. It was a realignment, a move to shift leverage away from the central court and back toward the larger pack territories, with Stonegate at the center of the new arrangement. It was dressed in the language of fairness and collective welfare, but the practical outcome of it, if it went through without preparation, would significantly weaken the court's financial position. She thought about this for a moment. She thought about the fact that she had no rank, no standing, no reason for anyone in the court to receive information from her as anything other than a minor curiosity from a lower-standing pack. She thought about the fact that Leon Marsh, who had been watching those 3 men all day, had probably already registered some version of this threat and was already managing it. She also thought about the fact that Leon Marsh had not been in the garden just now, and she had been, and she had heard specific numbers and a specific timeline that changed the precision of what he could do with the information he already had. She made a decision. She walked back inside. Finding Leon Marsh proved easier than she expected. He was in the corridor near the main hall entrance, speaking with one of the court officials, and he had the distracted focus of someone conducting one conversation while monitoring 3 others. She walked up to him with the directness she applied to everything and waited for a break in his conversation, which came within 30 seconds. Leon looked at her. "Yes? I have information about an unregistered proposal being planned for the final morning session," Alara said. It involves Marcus Fell and Edwin Croft, and at least one other pack leader I could not identify. I have specific figures and a specific timeline. I believe it is relevant to something you were already tracking today. Leon studied her for exactly the length of time it took him to assess whether she was wasting his time. Whatever he saw in her face told him she was not. "Come with me," he said. She followed him to a small side office. She told him everything she had heard. She told it clearly, in sequence, without editorializing. She gave him the numbers as she had heard them, acknowledged the one she was uncertain about, and noted what she had been able to infer versus what she had directly heard. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How did you come to be in that garden?" he said. "I was watching the room all evening," she said. "I noticed they were moving together with a specific purpose. I followed the pattern." "You followed the pattern," Leon said. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment longer. He had excellent eyes, the evaluating kind that did not perform what they were doing. "You are Alara Voss," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "From the presentation yesterday." "Yes." He was quiet for another moment that contained more than its duration suggested. Then, "Thank you, this is useful." He stood, which was a dismissal. Then, just before she reached the door, he said, "How long have you been watching rooms the way you watched today?" She turned back. "My whole life," she said, which was the same thing she had told Ren. "It is the only tool I have never been told I was not allowed to use." He looked at her with something she could not quite categorize, not surprise exactly, because she did not think Leon Marsh was easily surprised, but a kind of sharpened attention that was different from what had been there a moment before. She went back to the lodging room and went to sleep. The fourth day arrived gray and overcast, with the particular quality of air that comes before heavy rain. Alara dressed early, took the vial from her jacket and put it in the pocket of her dress instead, and went to breakfast. The morning session was tense in a way that was invisible if you were not paying attention. 3 things happened within the first hour that she tracked carefully. The court secretary altered the final morning's agenda, shifting the open floor discussion period to an earlier slot. This was a subtle reorganization that seemed administrative, but was functionally a preemption. It moved the window for unregistered proposals to a period when the council would have more time to respond. Secondly, Leon Marsh spent 20 minutes speaking privately with Kalen Dravon before the session formally opened. Thirdly, Marcus Fell, when he arrived for the morning session, noticed the agenda change and said nothing visibly, but his right hand closed into a brief tight fist against his leg. Small things, telling things. The morning passed. The afternoon presentations continued. Alara stood with the Ashwood group and waited. She was present in the way she was always present, thoroughly, quietly, without expectation. It was in the late afternoon that everything moved. She was walking back toward the lodging block alone, ahead of the rest of the Ashwood group, who had stopped to talk with females from another pack near the garden entrance. The path she was on was one of the less used routes, a narrow corridor between 2 stone buildings that cut time off the walk. 3 males appeared at the far end of the corridor. She knew immediately that this was not a coincidence. The way they moved, together, purposeful, without the casual randomness of people going somewhere for their own reasons. They were in their early 20s. She did not recognize them. They wore the marking colors of the Stonegate pack. She stopped walking. She did a rapid assessment of her options. The corridor had 1 entry and 1 exit, and she had entered from the end they were not blocking, which meant she could still leave the way she had come, but doing so would require turning her back on them, and she did not want to do that. "You are the one from yesterday," said the one in front. He had a pleasant face and an unpleasant voice. The wolfless girl who stood in the hall like she belonged there. Alara said nothing. She shifted her weight very slightly, settling it lower. A habit she did not remember learning, but had. "You embarrassed Marcus Fell's cousin at the presentation," the second one said. This was not true in any factual sense. She had simply existed in the same room as his cousin, without doing anything to anyone. But she understood that accuracy was not the point. She had 2 options. She could try to talk her way through this, which she assessed at a low probability of success, given their physical blocking of the corridor, and the specific way they had positioned themselves. Or she could make it physically difficult for them to do what they were considering, which she also assessed at a low probability of success, given that there were 3 of them, and they were all significantly larger than her. But low probability was not no probability. She backed up 2 steps, which gave her the wall to her left and the wall to her right, and the narrowest part of the corridor behind her, which equalized some of the size advantage. The first one moved forward. She moved with him, not away. She had spent enough years in the pack house watching training drills to know that moving away from a physical threat in a closed space was always the wrong choice. She got inside his reach before he could fully extend, and used her elbow hard against his ribs, which bought her approximately 2 seconds. 2 seconds was not enough. The second one caught her from the side. She fought back with everything she had: knees, elbows, hands, the small kitchen knife she had carried for 11 years as a practical habit, and which she had in her hand before she consciously decided to reach for it. She caught the second one across the forearm with it, which made him pull back. The first one, recovered from the elbow, grabbed her jacket. The third one, the one who had not spoken yet, moved in from her right side, and she twisted away from him, and in the twisting, her jacket pocket caught on the stonework of the wall, and she heard the small, precise sound of the vial breaking. She felt the liquid run over her hand. Warm, too warm for something that had been in a pocket. It ran over the cut on her forearm, a cut from the fight she had not fully registered until now, and the warmth became heat, and the heat became something that was not heat anymore, something that had no physical description in any framework she had, something that went directly through her skin, and into her blood, and through her blood, into the center of her chest. The door that had been closed for 19 years did not open slowly. It came off its hinges. The medic tent was at the eastern side of the summit grounds, away from the main lodging blocks, in a set of canvas-roofed structures that the court's medical staff occupied throughout the duration of every summit. It was a practical location, accessible from multiple directions without requiring passage through any of the formal areas. Paula Hart, the court healer, ran it with the organized efficiency of someone who had managed medical situations in complex, crowded environments for most of her career, and had developed zero tolerance for unnecessary complications. She was already awake when they arrived, which told Ilara something about the quality of information flow in Kalen Draven's court. Someone had communicated ahead, and the tent was ready. Paula took one look at the arm, sat Ilara in the examination chair without ceremony, and began working with the focused competence of a person who is very good at exactly one thing and does not waste time on anything that is not that thing. "Does it hurt?" Paula asked, not because she was uncertain, but because she was establishing Ilara's pain baseline. "Manageable," Ilara said. Paula made a sound that was neither approval nor disapproval, the professional sound of someone noting data. She cleaned the cut with a solution that stung precisely as much as it needed to, and not more, which Ilara appreciated. She applied a dressing with practiced speed. While she worked, Ilara sat very still and thought about the silver light. She had been trying to find a frame for it since the moment it faded, and she could not. Every physical description she tried fell short of what it had actually been. It was not like fire, because fire consumed. It was not like the light from a lamp or a candle, or even the sun. It was more like the moment just after sunrise, when the light has arrived fully, and is simply present in the world, with no drama about its own arrival. That quality of arrival without drama, of being exactly itself. She thought about the crack in the floor, the circle that had radiated out from her hand, with the precision of something following a rule it had always known, the 3 males, and the way they had gone still. She thought about 19 years of being told there was nothing inside her. She thought about this with the same careful attention she gave to everything, and she noticed that what she felt when she sat with it was not anger, exactly, though anger was present in the mix. It was something more like a very deep and thorough exhaustion, the exhaustion of having carried an incorrect story about yourself for so long that it had become structural, built into the architecture of your daily life, and now that structure was in the process of being taken down, and the physical effort of that demolition was evident. Paula finished the dressing and stepped back. "Keep it clean. Come back if there is any increased swelling." She paused, and for the first time she departed from pure clinical efficiency. She looked at Ilara directly. "Are you all right otherwise?" It was the same question she would hear many times in the coming days, and she would develop different answers for different contexts. For Paula, who was asking it medically, she said, "Physically, yes. The rest is not simple, but it is not in your domain." Paula nodded, as though this were entirely reasonable, which it was. "Good answer," she said, and let her go. Kalen was waiting outside. He had not left to return to the main building. He was standing in the night air, near the tent entrance, with his hands at his sides, and the expression of a man who has decided to wait, and is applying the same quality of attention to waiting that he applies to everything else. Leon was with him, 3 feet back, which was Leon's characteristic position, close enough to matter, far enough not to intrude. Elara came out, and they looked at each other in the dim light outside the tent. "The wound is dressed," she said. "Good," he said. They stood for a moment in the quiet. Around them, the summit grounds were largely settled into night, with only the patrol guards moving at their regular intervals, and a few lights still burning in the administrative wing. The air smelled of late summer grass, and the specific cool of a night that was approaching its coldest hour. "The records room," he said. "You should see what Leon and Percy found last night." "Now?" she said. "Now," he said, "tonight. While it is fresh and before the morning session makes everything more complicated." He paused. "If you are willing." She looked at him for a moment. She was tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, and everything to do with the accumulated weight of the last few days. But she was also more awake than she had been in years, awake in a way that felt cellular, rather than simply mental. And she understood that the records room, and what it contained, was something she needed to see before she could properly process any of the rest of it. "I am willing," she said. There is a kind of silence that arrives not when sound stops, but when it is completely overwhelmed. The sound in that corridor did not stop. The silver light that erupted from Elara's blood was simply so absolute, so immediate and total, that sound became irrelevant inside it. She felt it before she saw it. Something vast and ancient moving through every part of her body at once. Not violent, but enormous. The way a river feels vast when you are standing in the middle of it. Her knees hit the ground. She pressed her palm to the stone floor, and the light poured from her hand into the stone in a perfect circle outward, and the circle cracked the ground in a clean, deep line that ran 3 feet in every direction from her hand. The 3 males stumbled back. One of them hit the wall hard. The other 2 staggered into each other. All 3 of them went still in the specific, involuntary way of wolves, who have encountered something that triggers a response older than conscious thought. Something that lives in the oldest part of the brain and says, with total authority, "Stop." They stopped. Elara looked at her own hands. Her blood was silver, not dark, not red, not the ordinary color of an ordinary wound. It was silver, the way starlight is silver, its own source, its own illumination. The cut on her arm was glowing with it, not horribly, but undeniably, a steady, pulsing light that matched the rhythm of her heartbeat. The broken glass of the vial lay on the ground beside her, catching the light, scattered into 5 or 6 pieces. She looked at her hands for a long time. The 3 males had not moved. They were not frozen by anything external. They were simply still, the way animals go still, in the presence of something they do not have a category for. She could feel their attention on her like a physical weight. She could also feel something else, something under her own skin that had not been there before, something that moved through her like a current, powerful and continuous, and very, very old. She stood up. She did not think about standing up. Her body rose with a steadiness that was not hers in the way her body had previously been hers. She was taller somehow, not physically, but in the way that people can be taller when something inside them is fully awake and standing alongside them for the first time. The first male, the one with the pleasant face, made a sound in his throat. It was not threatening. It was the specific sound of a wolf reacting to something that outranked it at a level below language. Elara looked at him. She looked at all 3 of them. She was not angry. She was extraordinarily calm, which was more frightening than anger would have been, because anger is something people understand. "Leave," she said. Her voice came out different, not louder, but with a resonance in it that had not been there before, as if there was more of her now than there had been 3 minutes ago. They left, all 3 of them, quickly and without looking back. She stood alone in the corridor. The silver light was fading. It did not go suddenly. It receded the way tide recedes, steadily and completely, pulling back under her skin, back into wherever it had come from. Her blood, when she looked at the cut on her arm, was dark again, ordinary, but the ground around her was still cracked in that perfect circle, and no amount of going dark was going to undo the stone. She picked up the pieces of the vial carefully. She wrapped them in her handkerchief. She stood in the corridor for another minute, just breathing. Then she heard footsteps. They were coming from both ends of the corridor, from the direction she had come from, and from the direction the three males had fled. She turned to face the nearer sound. Two of Kaelin Dravon's royal guards appeared at the entrance to the corridor, moving with the controlled urgency of people who had been running, and arrived somewhere, and were now assessing the situation with professional speed. Behind them, at a distance of perhaps 40 feet, walking rather than running but covering ground very quickly, was Leon Marsh. Behind Leon, further back, was Kaelin Dravon. The guards reached Alara first. They looked at her, at the cracked ground, at the small pieces of glass she was holding in her handkerchief, at the cut on her forearm. One of them looked at the cracked stone in the floor. The crack was precise and clean, and had required something extraordinary to produce. The guard looked at it with the expression of someone who was professionally trained not to have expressions, and was currently struggling with that training. Leon arrived next. He looked at everything in sequence: Alara, the ground, the glass, the arm, and his face went through several rapid internal calculations in the space of about 2 seconds. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "The cut is minor," Alara said. He looked at the ground again. "What happened?" She told him, clearly and completely, in the same direct way she had told him about the levy meeting. 3 males, Stonegate colors, the physical confrontation, the vial breaking. She did not explain the light. She described what had happened, and left the explanation to whatever he was going to make of it. Kaelin reached them while she was finishing. He came to stand slightly behind Leon's left shoulder, which was not where an Alpha King stood. He stood in front of people. That was how his position worked. But he had apparently decided this was not the moment for positioning. He was looking at the crack in the ground with the very specific attention she had noticed him use all week on things that genuinely interested him. He let her finish. Then he looked at her arm. "Let someone see to that," he said. She was aware that her calm was very thorough, and that it might look, from the outside, like shock. It was not shock. She had gone through the shock while it was happening, and had come out the other side, into a strange, clear stillness that felt like nothing she had felt before in her life, and which she did not yet have language for. "I am fine," she said. "That was not a question," he said. He looked at one of the guards. "Bring the healer." The guard went. Leon was looking at the ground. He crouched briefly, touched the edge of the crack with 2 fingers, and stood back up. He said nothing, but he looked at Kaelin with an expression that Alara recognized. She had seen it in people who had been working toward something for a long time, and had just received confirmation that they were in the right place. The healer arrived quickly, a brisk, efficient woman named Paula Hart, who had been with the court's medical staff for 2 decades, and who handled extraordinary things with the practical competence of someone who had been in the court's proximity long enough to stop being surprised by most things. She examined Alara's arm without ceremony, cleaned it, and dressed it in about 4 minutes. While this was happening, Leon spoke quietly with Kaelin. Alara could not hear what they said. She watched the conversation in her peripheral vision. Kaelin listened, asked one question. Leon answered it briefly. Kaelin looked at Alara. When Paula finished with the arm, Kaelin spoke. "I would like you to come with us," he said, not as a command, though he had the authority to command. More as the statement of someone who was telling you what was going to happen next, because they thought you deserved to know. "Where?" Alara asked. "The records room," he said. "I had something requested last night. I think you may want to see it." Alara looked at him for a moment. She thought about Marin's instruction, and the vial, and the silver light, and the crack in the floor, and the 19 years of being told there was nothing inside her. She thought about all of it very quickly, in the compressed way of someone who has learned to think clearly under pressure. "All right," she said. They walked through the summit building in a group. Kaelin, Leon, Alara, and 2 guards at a distance, respectful enough not to look like an escort, and close enough to function as one. People in the corridors noticed. They could not help noticing. The Alpha King walking somewhere with deliberate purpose was always something people noticed. The fact that a young woman from a minor pack was beside him, rather than behind him, was additionally notable. Alara heard several sharp intakes of breath as they passed. She did not look at anyone. The records room was at the back of the administrative wing. behind a heavy door that required a specific key and the authorization of both a court official and a senior council member. The archivist, a small, careful man named Percy Vane who had clearly been waiting and was clearly managing a significant amount of nervous energy, met them at the door. He had several documents laid out on the wide table inside, with small paper markers indicating specific pages and passages. Kaelin directed Alara to the table. He stood beside her, which meant she was not being shown something as an audience member, but as a participant, and she noted this. Percy pointed to the first document. It was old, genuinely old, the paper stiff and darkened with age, the script the kind of ancient hand that Marin had taught her to read. Percy had placed a transcript beside it, which was thoughtful. "This is from the first records," Percy said. He was very precise, the way archivists usually were about their materials. "The oldest territorial documents we hold. It describes a bloodline that predates the current pack structure by at least 6 generations." He indicated a passage. "They are referred to as silver blood carriers. The name is literal. Their blood physically presents as silver under specific conditions." Alara looked at the passage. She read it. Then she read the transcript of it. Her eyes moved back and forth between the two. "What conditions?" she said. Percy blinked, apparently not expecting her to ask the next logical question immediately. "A significant physical trauma, sufficient to trigger the bloodlines." The document uses the word waking, the waking of the bloodline. "And what does the waking do?" Alara asked. Leon and Kaelin were both watching her. She was aware of this and kept reading while she talked. Percy indicated the next section. The silver blood carriers were not wolves in the standard sense. They did not carry an inner wolf. They carried the source. The document describes them as, he paused, choosing the accurate word carefully, the origin point of the wolf bloodlines. They were the first. The wolves that came after them, including every pack that currently exists, carried diluted descendants of the original silver blood. But the carriers themselves have something older, something that does not shift and does not announce itself and does not behave like anything currently in use. Alara stood very still. "There is more," Percy said carefully. "The bloodline was actively suppressed. Starting approximately 80 years ago, there was a systematic effort. The documents do not say who organized it or why, but the evidence is clear, to remove silver blood carriers from the public record. Names struck from pack registries. Family lines buried, the trait made to appear as an absence, as wolflessness, so that any carrier who appeared would be dismissed rather than identified." The room was completely silent. Alara looked at the old paper on the table. She looked at the ancient script she had learned to read in a cottage at the edge of the Ashwood territory, sitting at a small table with a cup of tea that tasted like no tea she had ever had before. She thought about Marin's eyes, the particular weight in them, the years of watching her with that careful, specific attention. She thought about the instruction, "Do not be afraid of yourself." She turned and looked at Kaelin Dravon. He was looking back at her with gray eyes that had been looking for something for 5 years and were currently very still. "You found this last night," she said. "I requested it last night," he said. "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. That was not evasion. She could tell the difference between evasion and someone choosing precision. "Because something in the way your registry entry was written did not match any category I had a proper name for," he said. "And I do not leave things without proper names if I can help it." She looked back at the document, at the ancient script and the history it contained, and all the years it described, all the lives reduced to suppression and silence, because someone had decided the thing they carried was more dangerous than convenient. She understood, standing in that room, that the thing that had just woken up inside her was not an accident. It had always been there. Every year she had spent being told she was less, being looked at with that specific combination of discomfort and deflection, being called hollow and practical and wolfless and tolerated. All of it had been built on a lie that was not even specifically about her, but which she had spent her entire life living inside. She felt something move through her chest that was not quite anger, and was not quite grief, but was close relatives of both. "What happens now?" she said. Kaelin looked at her, with an expression that was the most openly direct she had seen from him all week. "Now," he said, "we establish what you are, properly, in the record." He said it as if it were a simple matter of administration. She understood that it was going to be very far from simple. She looked at the cracked stone she could not see from here but knew was there, in the corridor outside, permanent and absolute. "All right," she said, for the second time that night. "Then let's begin." The word spread through the summit grounds faster than it had any reasonable right to. By the following morning, before the formal sessions opened, the details had already moved through every lodging block, every common room, and every breakfast table in the building. Not accurately. The story that traveled was the shape of what had happened, rather than the precise content of it. 3 males from Stonegate, a corridor, a light that people at 100 feet away in the main building had reportedly seen through stone walls, a crack in the floor, the Alpha King's guards arriving, the Alpha King himself arriving. The part about the girl being wolfless was, somehow, the detail that traveled fastest. It was the detail that people found most difficult to reconcile with the rest of the information, which meant it was the detail they repeated most often as they tried to reconcile it. Alara heard all of this while eating breakfast alone in the corner of the dining hall that had good sight lines. She ate her bread and her fruit, and drank her tea, and listened to the room with both ears, and said nothing. Lena Hatch, when she found Alara at the table, sat down across from her with an expression that was working very hard to be casual. "Everyone is saying something happened to you last night," she said. "Something happened in a corridor near the lodging block," Alara said. "It involved me." Lena looked at her for a moment. She had the particular struggle of someone deciding whether to ask the specific question or the general one. "Are you all right?" Alara looked at Lena. This was, she reflected, the first time in her memory that Lena Hatch had asked her a question that was entirely about her well-being, with no other agenda behind it. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." Lena nodded. She seemed to want to say more, and could not find the words for it, which was an unusual condition for Lena. She left after a moment, and did not bring it up again. The morning session was not what anyone expected. Kaelin had been awake before the dawn. Leon knew this because he himself had been awake before the dawn, working with Percy Vane on the additional documents the night's research had pulled up. By the time the senior council assembled for the morning briefing, Leon had a prepared summary of the bloodline records and a recommendation for how to proceed. By the time the morning session formally opened, Kaelin had made his decision. What he did was this. He opened the formal session as usual, moved through the administrative review with his customary efficiency, and then, at the point in the agenda where the council's discussion period normally sat, he introduced a topic that was not on the agenda. "The summit registry contains an error," he said. His voice was even and entirely without drama. "A registration entry has been misclassified. This misclassification relates to a broader records issue that I intend to address formally. The matter concerns an individual currently registered under the Ashwood Pack listing." The room registered this. Pack leaders shifted. Council members exchanged looks. Marcus Fell went very still in his chair, which Alara, who was standing at the back of the hall, noticed immediately. Kaelin nodded to Percy Vane, who had been seated at the council table with his documents organized in front of him. Percy, who had clearly been briefed and prepared, and was managing his nerves with the dignity of a man who cared deeply about accuracy in records, stood and gave a 15-minute presentation. He presented the historical documents. He presented the evidence of the bloodline. He presented the evidence of the systematic suppression. He used precise, factual language throughout and did not embellish a single word. The hall listened. When Percy finished, Kaelin looked at the room. "The registration of Alara Voss as wolfless is incorrect," he said. "She carries the silver blood, a classification that predates the current pack structure. She is not without an inner wolf. She carries something older than the inner wolf. The appropriate classification has not existed in active records for 3 generations, because those records were deliberately removed. They are being formally restored." Marcus Fell made a sound. Kaelin looked at him. It was the same look he had given him during the presentation. 3 seconds, specific, entirely sufficient. Marcus Fell said nothing further. From the back of the hall, Alara watched all of this with the particular clarity of someone watching something that is about them, but is also bigger than them. The record being corrected, her name being spoken in this room, not as a footnote or an inconvenience, but as a fact that required acknowledgement. It was an extraordinary thing. She held on to her steady calm with both hands, because underneath it was something very large that she did not want to release in this room. After the session, Leon found her in the corridor, and told her that Kalen wanted to speak with her privately. She followed him to the same small side office she had been in before. Kalen was there, standing near the window, which meant he had arrived before her and positioned himself in the way people do when they need the discipline of a focal point. He turned when she came in. Leon closed the door. "The 3 males from last night have been identified," Kalen said. "They are being dealt with through the Stonegate Pack's chain of accountability. Marcus Fell has been informed of the situation and its context." "And the levy proposal?" Ilara asked. Kalen looked at her for a moment. He glanced at Leon. "You know about that." "I heard them discussing it the night before last, in the garden," Ilara said. "I gave the information to your beta." Kalen looked at Leon. "You did not mention that the source was her." "I mentioned that the source was reliable," Leon said, without any indication that he was apologizing for this, because Leon Marsh did not particularly apologize for things he had decided deliberately. Kalen looked back at Ilara. She met his eyes directly. "The proposal has been preempted," he said. "The agenda change this morning moved the discussion window. Marcus Fell and Edwin Croft found themselves without the timing they needed, and without the votes they had anticipated, partly because the information you provided allowed us to address 2 of their supporters before the morning session." Ilara absorbed this. "I am glad it was useful," she said. He was looking at her with the expression she had categorized as genuine attention, the kind with nothing performative in it. "Why did you bring it to Leon?" he asked. "Because it was the practical thing to do," she said. "It was information that belonged in the right hands. Leon's hands were the right ones." "Many people would have kept that information," Kalen said, "used it as leverage, or simply stayed out of it entirely." "Many people have more to protect than I do," Ilara said. "I had nothing to gain from keeping it, and nothing to lose from giving it. And I do not generally stay out of things, when staying out makes something worse." He was quiet for a moment. She had the sense that he was doing the same thing she did, processing something carefully, filing it in the right place, not saying a thing before he was certain of the shape of it. "The bloodline records are being formally restored to the active registry," he said. "Your classification will be corrected. What that means practically, what rights, what position, what implications, is not yet fully mapped, because those records have been missing for 3 generations, and the position has no current template." He paused. "I want you to understand that I intend to establish one." Ilara looked at him steadily. "Why?" she asked. It was the same question she had asked last night, and he had been precise in his answer, and she was asking it again, because the context was different now. He was quiet long enough that she could see him making a decision about the answer. "Because the historical record shows that silver blood carriers were treated as threats to be removed, rather than as what they actually were," he said. "That was a wrong that was done under a previous structure, but it is a wrong that exists inside the system I currently run, and I do not tolerate wrongs inside my system when I have the power to correct them." It was not a personal answer. It was an institutional answer. She noted the distinction, and also noted that it was probably the most honest kind of answer she could have expected at this particular point in a conversation, with a man she had known for 5 days. "I need to speak with someone before any formal decisions are made," she said. He nodded once, which told her that he had already anticipated she would need something like this, and was prepared to accommodate it. "Where?" he asked. "Home," she said. "The cottage near the Ashwood border." He looked at her for a moment, with those storm-gray eyes. "I will arrange an escort," he said. "I do not need an escort." "No," he agreed. "But you are now carrying a formal court status that requires documentation and verification, and until that documentation is complete, it is in my interest, as well as yours, that nothing happened to you in transit." He said it practically, not protectively, which she found more acceptable. "The escort will be 2 people. They will be unobtrusive." She thought about this. "All right," she said. 3rd time in 2 days, she had said those words to him. She noticed that each time she said them, she meant them slightly more. She left the summit grounds the following morning, with 2 of Leon's people at a respectful distance. She traveled back across the territory toward Ashwood. The journey took the better part of a day. She sat in the coach and thought about silver blood and old documents, and a crack in a stone floor, and what it meant to have spent 19 years being told a story about yourself that was not true. She thought about what Marin had known, what Marin had always known, the cottage, the tea, the 11 years of teaching, the particular way those dark old eyes had always looked at her. She thought about her mother's hand in the yard before she left, the way it had held hers without words. She thought about Kalen Dravon saying, "I do not tolerate wrongs inside my system when I have the power to correct them," and the way he had said it, like a fact about himself that he had long since stopped feeling the need to qualify. She arrived at the border of Ashwood territory in the early evening. She asked the escort to wait at the main path and walked the last stretch to the cottage alone. The gate was open. The lamp was lit inside. Marin was sitting in her chair by the fire. She looked up when Alara came through the door, and her eyes held everything they always held: depth, warmth, and the very old particular kind of patience that comes from having waited for the right moment across a great many years, and finally having it arrive. Alara sat down across from her. She looked at the fire for a moment. Then she looked at Marin. "Tell me everything," she said. The session that followed the formal record restoration was not the end of the morning. Kalen kept it moving with the characteristic efficiency that Alara had come to recognize as one of his most deliberate tools. He understood that momentum was a kind of argument, that keeping things in motion did not allow resistance to calcify into obstruction. The pack leaders who had not objected formally watched the morning with the particular attention of people who were updating their assessments of the situation in real time. Leon managed the room's smaller dynamics with the minimal visible effort he brought to everything. Alara observed him work across the morning and understood, not for the first time that week, why Kalen kept him so close. Leon had the capacity to manage people without any of them being fully certain they were being managed, which was a specific and very rare skill. He understood the difference between leading someone to a conclusion and forcing them to it, and he reliably chose the approach that would produce the most durable result. After the session closed for the midday break, 3 separate pack leaders came to Alara individually, in different parts of the hall, and introduced themselves. Not formally, not with the ceremony of official introduction. They came the way people come when they want to establish something quietly, without it appearing in any record of the day. The first was the old Western elder who had inclined his head to her in the hall. Up close, he was even older than he had appeared from across the room, his face a map of decades, his eyes, the particular clear quality of eyes that had seen many things and stopped being surprised by most of them. He told her his name was Bernard Price, and that he had known of the silver blood history since he was young, because his own grandmother had spoken of it, and that he was glad to live long enough to see the record corrected. She thanked him simply, and meant it simply, and he nodded once and moved away without prolonging the moment, which was its own form of respect. The second was a woman named Nina Calloway, from a mid-territory pack, who had dark eyes and a direct manner, and who introduced herself with a specific intent that Alara recognized within 2 sentences. Nina wanted to understand the practical implications of the bloodline restoration, not out of hostility, but out of the practical interest of a pack leader who needed to update her understanding of how the territorial legal structure now worked. Alara told her honestly that those implications were still being determined, and that the court was in the process of developing the framework. Nina accepted this with a nod and the expression of someone filing information for future use. Before she left, she said, quietly, "My pack has a healer who is very old. She has never spoken of the silver blood directly, but I have thought, since this morning, that perhaps she has been waiting for something before she spoke." She paused. "I will ask her." The third was a young pack leader from the Northern Territory, recently appointed, who was clearly still in the early stages of learning how to inhabit the authority of his position without either shrinking from it or overclaiming it. He introduced himself as Owen Marsh, no relation to Leon, as he specified immediately, perhaps because the name similarity had caused confusion before, and he said directly that he had voted in support of the record restoration and that he intended to speak with the members of his pack's elder council about the historical context that morning had provided. Alara thanked him. He was nervous. She found this more endearing than awkward. She told him she appreciated the directness, which seemed to help. These 3 interactions, brief and specific and unceremonious, told her something she had not known before the morning session. The bloodline restoration was not simply a correction of an administrative wrong. It was also a kind of signal. The signal that something that had been deliberately made invisible was now visible again, and that the people who had carried some version of this knowledge in whatever fragmented form it had survived in were now free to bring it forward. Bernard Price's grandmother. Nina Calloway's elderly healer. All those years of whispered references to something that had no longer had an official name. She sat with this for a long time during the midday break, alone in a quiet corner of the smaller dining room, eating methodically and thinking. She thought about Marin in the cottage and the 40 years of carrying the knowledge alone. She thought about what it had cost, not in any dramatic sense, but in the accumulated ordinary cost of holding something no one else could confirm, of keeping alive a truth that the official world had decided did not exist. That kind of carrying left marks. It changed the shape of a life. Marin's life had been organized around a secret for so long that the secret and the life had become inseparable, and what it might feel like for Marin to have that secret become, finally, a public record, she could not quite calculate it. She finished her food. She folded her napkin. She made her plan for the afternoon. She was going to speak with Leon about the travel arrangements. She was going to the cottage. She needed to see Marin before any further decisions were made, because whatever came next belonged as much to her grandmother as to anyone, and she was not going to allow decisions about the future to be made in rooms Marin was not part of. She stood up and went to find Leon. Marin did not begin immediately. She rose from her chair with the careful deliberateness of someone whose body moved more slowly than their mind, and poured 2 cups of tea from the pot that had been sitting warm on the side of the fireplace. She put one in Ilara's hands and sat back down with the other. She looked at the fire. "Your mother's name was Nora Voss," she said. "Her name before that was Nora Calloway, and her name before that, her true bloodline name, the one that was struck from the records before she was born, was Nora Silver." Ilara looked at her. "I am your grandmother," Marin said. "Your mother's mother. My name was not always Marin. It was Marin Calloway, and then Marin Silver, and then simply Marin, when being simply Marin became the safer thing." The fire crackled. Outside, the evening settled into darkness around the cottage. Ilara held her tea with both hands and listened. Marin had been 17 years old when the suppression began in earnest. She described it without drama, because she had lived with the facts of it for so long, that they had lost the shape of horror and taken on the shape of history, which is what happens to pain when it is carried long enough. There had been a man, a very powerful man, a senior council member from 2 generations prior to Kalen, who had begun to consolidate territorial power in a way that the silver blood carriers represented an obstacle to, not because they were a threat in the military sense, because they were a thread to an older authority, a bloodline connection to the origin of pack law that predated the current structure, and, if formally recognized, would carry specific rights that the current structure had quietly assumed were no longer relevant. The suppression was efficient. Names removed from records, families scattered. Children of carriers raised with their bloodline suppressed through a specific treatment given to newborns, a preparation that blocked the silver blood from waking for years, sometimes for entire lifetimes, so that the carrier would present as wolfless and be dismissed rather than identified. It had been described in documents as a medical precaution. It had been administered by healers who were told it was for the child's protection. Some of them believed this. Some of them did not ask. Marin had escaped because she was already an adult when the suppression began, and she was stubborn and very good at being hard to find. She had watched her mother's name struck from the record. She had watched cousins and relatives disappear into pack life as wolfless members, unexplained and unacknowledged. She had spent decades moving from territory to territory at the edges of things, learning, waiting, keeping the knowledge alive in the one place no one could take it from her, her own mind. And then she had found Ilara's mother. Nora had been raised the same way, the bloodline suppressed in infancy, the silver blood dormant, the girl growing up with no knowledge of what she carried. Marin had found her when Nora was 16, and had spent 2 careful years building trust before telling her any of it. The telling had been hard, the believing had been harder, but Nora was a precise and careful person who, once given evidence, followed it wherever it led, and the evidence Marin had was substantial. Nora had chosen Gareth Voss 2 years later. Marin had not argued with this. Gareth was stable and positioned, and the Ashwood territory was far from the center of the current court's attention, which made it safer than more visible options. What they had not anticipated was that Gareth would respond to a wolfless daughter by turning away from her entirely, which meant the environment Ilara grew up in was defined by a specific absence that was no one person's cruelty, but was nonetheless real and consequential. Marin had positioned herself at the edge of the Ashwood territory before Alara was born. "You planned this," Alara said. "I prepared," Marin said. "There is a difference. Planning suggests certainty. I was not certain. I knew you would carry the bloodline. Silver blood passes through the female line, always. I knew it would be suppressed in you at birth, because that was standard practice for known carrier lines, and your mother's line was known to the people who maintained those practices. I did not know when the blood would wake. I did not know what would wake it. I only knew that the preparation in the vial would accelerate the waking if the right conditions presented themselves." "The right conditions," Alara said. "Being physically threatened. Significant physical stress was identified in the old records as a reliable trigger," Marin said. "I did not intend for it to be that kind of stress. I hoped it might be something less, intense cold, or an emotional extremity, or the right piece of music, which sounds absurd, but the old records mention it." She paused. "I am sorry. It was what it was." Alara thought about the corridor. She thought about the particular quality of the silver light. Overwhelming, and not frightening, as if it were something that had been waiting to be welcomed, rather than something that had been forced out. "Why did you not simply tell me?" Alara asked. "Years ago. Any of this?" Marin was quiet for a moment. "Because children told things they cannot yet carry, often carry them wrong," she said. "And because knowing would have made you visible in a way that was not yet safe. The suppression was still being actively enforced when you were young. Less so now. The man who organized it died 15 years ago, and his specific structure did not fully survive him. But the practice continued out of habit and institutional momentum. I did not want to wake something in you before you were capable of standing in it." Alara thought about 19 years of being told there was nothing inside her. She thought about Owen Birch. She thought about standing in the kitchen alone after the pack meeting, when her father had looked at her like a problem to manage. "You watched all of it," she said. "Yes," Marin said. She did not apologize for it. She said it the way she said most things, as a fact, clearly, without softening. "You needed to become who you are without the interference of knowing what you might become. The person you are now, the way you watch rooms, the way you think, the steadiness you carry, the precision. Those things come from the life you lived, not from the blood. The blood is what you are. The steadiness is who you are. I could not give you one without the other developing naturally." The fire burned lower. Alara looked at it. She thought about what it felt like to be inside a story someone else had been holding for you. She was not angry at Marin. She noted this because she had wondered, on the journey here, whether she would be. Anger requires a certain surprise in it, a certain sense of betrayal, and the more she sat with the reality of what Marin had done, and why, the less she found surprise. Marin had been protective in the way of someone who has watched a whole generation pay the price of being visible before they were ready, and she had made the choice that kept Alara safest for the longest time. The choice had costs. Alara had lived those costs. But they were comprehensible costs, made by someone who loved her, and she was finding that comprehension and anger had difficulty existing in the same space. "My mother knows?" Alara asked. "Your mother has known since she was 18, Marin said. "She chose to carry it quietly, because it was the choice that protected you. It has cost her." Marin paused. "She will want to speak with you." Alara nodded. She turned the empty teacup in her hands. "The man at the summit, Kalen Dravon. He is restoring the bloodline records." Marin looked at her with those old, precise eyes. "I know." "How do you know?" "Because I have been watching the territories for 40 years, and this particular young Alpha King has been doing things that no previous Alpha King had the precision or the willingness to do, and I had begun to believe that the timing was approaching." Alara studied her. "You knew about him." "I knew of him. I did not know how he would respond. That part I could not plan." "But you sent me to the summit," Alara said. "I gave you a vial," Marin said carefully. "You went to the summit because your pack's elder submitted your name, and the law required attendance. I did not arrange that. You could have warned me about the vial sooner, given me time to decide whether to take it." "Yes," Marin agreed. "I could have. That choice I will not defend except to say that I was afraid, not of you, of losing you before anything could be set right." She paused. "That was my fear, not your need, and it was not entirely fair." This was the closest thing to an acknowledgement of a mistake that Marin had ever offered her, and Alara recognized it for what it was. "I am not easy to lose," she said. Marin's face moved in a way that was, on Marin's face, the equivalent of a full smile. "No," she agreed. "You are not." They sat for a while longer. The fire rebuilt itself from the coals, small and steady. Outside, the Ashwood territory settled into night, and somewhere in the pack house across the forest, Alara's mother was awake, because Nora Voss had always slept badly when Alara was away. Before Alara left, Marin took her hands in both of her own, an unusual gesture for a woman who was not generally given to physical contact. She looked at Alara for a moment with all of those years in her eyes. "The thing that was done to your bloodline was done by frightened people, trying to hold on to power they did not want to share," she said. "What happens now? The record being corrected, the status being acknowledged. None of that undoes the years. But it changes what comes after them, and what comes after them is yours." She pressed Alara's hands once. All of it. Every decision, every direction, every choice, about what to do with what you are. Yours. Alara held her grandmother's hands for a moment. Then she said goodbye, and walked out into the dark, toward the escort waiting on the main path, and then back toward the summit, and the man waiting there who had things to do, and toward a future that was beginning, very slowly but very certainly, to take a shape. On the way back, she thought about Kaelin Draven saying, "I do not tolerate wrongs inside my system when I have the power to correct them." She thought about the crack in the stone floor. She thought about what it felt like to stand up in that corridor with something vast and old and entirely hers moving through her blood for the first time. She thought about what Marin had said, "The steadiness is who you are." She held on to that thought all the way back through the dark. She stayed at the cottage longer than she had planned. Not because there was more to say, though there was. Not because she was reluctant to leave, though that was also true. But because sitting in that small room with the fire and the lamp and the smell of herbs and old books, she felt something settle in her that had not been settled before. The particular piece of a thing that has been open too long, finally being closed correctly. Marin made more tea. They drank it slowly. Alara asked about the names. The bloodline names. Silver, Calloway. The names that had been systematically removed from the records and replaced with pack names and pack affiliations. Marin told her what she knew, which was considerable. The original Silver lineage had been large, dozens of families across many territories, bound not by pack but by bloodline. The suppression had scattered them, renamed them, silenced them. Some had simply lived out their lives without ever knowing what they carried. Others had known and been unable to speak of it. The knowledge had survived, when it survived at all, in exactly the way all dangerous knowledge survives. In small rooms, in trusted hands, in the careful, deliberate choices of people who understood that keeping a truth alive sometimes meant keeping it very small and very quiet for a very long time. Alara thought about the difference between knowledge kept small by necessity and knowledge given proper space to exist. She thought about what the records room at the summit now contained. She thought about Percy Vane and his careful documents and his precise cross-referencing, and what it meant to have 40 years of a secret finally enter the official language of the world. She asked Marin about the suppression preparation, the thing given to newborns of known carrier lines. Marin was quiet for a moment before she answered. "A healer named Agnes Cole developed the reversal preparation," she said. Agnes Cole, not Agnes Fern, the pack elder of Ashwood who had submitted Alara's name for the summit. A different Agnes, long dead. It was based on the understanding that the suppression was not removal, it was containment. The blood was never gone, it was sealed. She looked at Alara. The vial did not give you anything that was not already yours. It broke the seal. Alara thought about this for a long time, in the silence that followed. She thought about 19 years of feeling nothing in the place where other people felt their wolves. She had categorized that absence correctly, just not completely. It was an absence, but the absence had been manufactured. The thing that should have been there had been there all along, held in suspension by something that had been administered before she could consent to or refuse it. She found, sitting with this, that the feeling it produced was not entirely anger, and was not entirely grief, and was not entirely relief. It was all three, layered so precisely they were difficult to separate. She let them all be present without trying to sort them into something simpler. because they were not simple, and sorting them into something simpler would have been a form of dishonesty she was unwilling to practice. Will there be others? She asked. Other carriers who are still suppressed, who do not know. Marin met her eyes. Almost certainly, she said. The practice was widespread enough that its effects are still present. There may be people alive today who are wolfless by record and silver blood by truth, and who have never had any access to the knowledge or to a reversal preparation. Alara held this thought for a moment. The court's framework, she said, the one they are developing for the bloodline status. It needs to include a mechanism for identifying and reaching other carriers. Marin looked at her. Yes, she said simply. It does. Alara made a note of this in the part of her mind where she kept the things she intended to act on. It joined several other items that had accumulated there over the last 2 days. The note was specific. This is not only about me. It was never only about me. She stood to leave. She gathered her jacket from the hook by the door. At the threshold, she turned back once more and looked at her grandmother in the lamplight. Old, substantial, entirely at rest in herself, in the way of someone who has done a long, hard thing and done it correctly. Come to the court session when this is formalized, Alara said. When Kaelin Dravan meets with you, I want you in the room with me. Marin looked at her for a moment. I am old, she said. I travel slowly. I will send a proper coach, Alara said, with enough cushioning that you have nothing to object to. The corners of Marin's eyes moved. All right, she said. Alara walked out into the night and found the escort waiting exactly where she had left them, patient and professional, and entirely without complaint about the length of the visit. She walked to the coach. She got in. She held the sealed document she had received from Kaelin in her hands in the dark. Outside, the ashwood forest moved in a light wind. The stars were thick overhead. Somewhere in the pack house across the trees, her mother was still awake, because her mother had never slept well when Alara was away. She thought about the conversation waiting for her there too, the one with Nora Voss, who had known for 20 years what she carried, and had held it quietly and alone inside a marriage and a life that had not made room for it. That conversation was going to be harder in some ways than the one with Marin, because Marin had been a keeper of the truth, and her mother had been a keeper of the silence. And the silence was the thing that had shaped Alara's daily life most directly. Understanding why it had existed did not mean there was nothing to say about the years it had covered. But she was going to have that conversation. She was going to have all of them, one at a time, clearly and directly, the way she did everything. The coach moved. The dark road opened ahead. She arrived back at the summit grounds before sunrise on the second day. The escort had been efficient and unobtrusive exactly as promised, and they separated from her at the main gate with a brief, professional acknowledgement that did not require anything from her, which she appreciated. She went back to the lodging room and slept for 4 hours with the focus of someone who understood that rest was practical rather than optional. When she woke, she washed her face, changed her dress, and went to find Leon. He was in the administrative corridor, already working. This did not surprise her. He had the bearing of someone for whom work was not a burden but a baseline condition. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. "You are back," he said. "I said I would be." He assessed her quickly in the way he assessed everything. Efficiently, without making it obvious he was doing it. "The Alpha King would like to see you before the morning session." "I know," she said. This seemed to mildly interest him. "How do you know?" "Because the morning session includes the formal announcement of the bloodline record restoration, and there are several things that will need to be decided before that announcement is made, and decisions require the people involved in them to be in the same room." She paused. "Is he in the private study?" Leon looked at her for a moment. "Yes," he said. She found the private study on the second floor of the administrative wing, where the door was open, and Kaelin was standing at the window, in the particular posture of someone who had been awake since before dawn, and was using the view of the grounds to think. He heard her come in and turned. He looked at her with the directness she had come to associate with him. No preamble, no social warmth as a buffer. Just a person in front of another person, attending. "You went," he said. "I said I needed to. You came back." "I said I would." She held his gaze. "I had the conversation I needed to have. I have what I needed from it." He waited. "My grandmother is the woman at the cottage," Alara said. She has been keeping the bloodline knowledge for 40 years. She knew what I carried before I was born. She made the preparation that was in the vial. She managed the situation as well as she was able to, with the resources available to her, which were limited, primarily because the resources available to people who are trying to preserve something that someone powerful has decided to erase are always limited. He was listening with that complete, specific attention. She is old and she has been carrying this alone for a very long time, Alara said. I want whatever formal process is coming to acknowledge that. Not publicly, if that creates a complication. I understand that the institutional record and the personal record are different things, but I want it known. It will be known, Kaelin said. I will ensure that. She nodded once. Good. She paused. What happens in the session this morning? He turned slightly away from the window, toward the table where his morning's papers were organized. I am formally presenting the bloodline record restoration to the assembled pack leaders. The document will be entered into the active summit registry with the correct classification. Your entry will be updated. He was precise about it, the way he was precise about all things. The council has questions. The pack leaders will have reactions. Some of those reactions will be resistant. Marcus fell, Alara said. Marcus fell, he agreed. And two others whose territorial positions give them a specific interest in the bloodline status, not being formally recognized. The original suppression served their predecessors, and they are comfortable with the conditions it created. And you are not comfortable with those conditions. No, he said. It was simple and absolute. She looked at him. She had been looking at him all week, across halls, across rooms, across the specific distance that existed between his position and hers, and she had been building a clear picture of him in the way she built clear pictures of things that mattered. What she saw was a man who had organized his entire existence around the principle of precision, precise in his thinking, precise in his actions, precise in his loyalties, which were few in number and unconditional in practice. He was not warm in the conventional sense. He did not perform warmth for comfort, but he was honest in a way that was rarer and more useful than warmth, and he was fair in a way that went beyond policy and into something personal, the kind of fairness that costs something, rather than the kind that is simply convenient. What do you need from me in the session? She asked. He paused. It was a very brief pause, but she caught it. Your presence, he said. Nothing performative. Just present. I am always present, she said. Something crossed his face. It was gone in a moment, but it was there. A very brief relaxation of whatever he maintained in the specific way that people who carry responsibility all the time sometimes allow themselves, briefly, to set a fraction of it down. I am beginning to understand that, he said. The morning session was unlike the sessions that had preceded it. Kaelin opened the floor with the bloodline record restoration, without the kind of preamble that softened things into palatability. He presented it as what it was, a correction of a deliberate wrong carried out through the administrative machinery of a predecessor's court, affecting a bloodline that had rights predating the current pack structure, and was being formally restored to the record now. Percy Vane presented the documentation with his characteristic precision. Ilara stood at the side of the council table, not on the pack leader's side, not on the council's side, but where Leon had indicated, which was a position that was neither behind nor in front of anyone, but simply alongside. She stood there with her hands folded in front of her, and her face turned toward the room, and she was simply present, which was what he had asked for. The reactions came in the order she had predicted. Marcus Fell was first, with a version of formal objection that was clearly prepared, and which was logically insufficient even by his own pack's legal standards. Kaelin answered it precisely, and without unnecessary elaboration, the way you answer something that does not deserve more than the correct amount of words. Two other pack leaders objected on territorial grounds. The court legal advisor addressed both objections with the specific case law that applied, and the discussion was over within 12 minutes. What she had not predicted was what happened after the objections were addressed. An elder from the Western Territories, a very old man she did not know, stood. He was not someone who had spoken in any of the sessions she had observed. He rose slowly, and with the particular authority of someone who is very old and has entirely stopped caring what anyone thinks of the timing of what they say. He looked at Alara. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he inclined his head toward her. Not a bow, not a formal submission, just an acknowledgement. The specific acknowledgement, of someone who recognizes a thing that has been absent from the room for a very long time and registers its return. She inclined her head back. It was the correct response, and she felt it, rather than decided it. 3 other pack leaders followed the elder's gesture, one by one, without discussion among themselves. The session continued. The documentation was entered into the record. The announcement was formally made and formally registered. By the time the session closed, what had been buried for 3 generations existed again in the world, not just in the records but in the room, in the shape of the morning, in the way the air had shifted around something that had been given back its proper weight. Ilara ate lunch alone. She needed to be alone with her thinking, and she had learned over many years to recognize and honor that need. She sat in the smaller dining area that was less populated during the midday hour, and she ate carefully and thought. She thought about her mother. She thought about what it would mean to have a conversation with Nora Voss now. A real conversation. The kind that had not been fully possible before because there had been too much silence built into the structure of their relationship, too many things that could not be said inside the pack house, with Gareth's particular absence filling the rooms. She thought about what it would feel like to have that conversation. She thought it would feel, probably, like the door coming off its hinges in the corridor, overwhelming and not frightening, like something returning to where it had always belonged. She thought about the future. This was new territory. She had spent 19 years with a future that was a narrow corridor, defined by what she was not, limited by what she did not carry, shaped by the space other people's certainties had not left for her. That corridor had been replaced, sometime in the last week, with something that had no clear edges yet. Open space was harder to navigate than corridors, but she found, sitting with it, that hard to navigate was entirely different from impossible, and impossible was the only condition she was truly uncertain about. She thought about Kalen Dravon. She thought about him carefully and honestly, because she was always careful and honest about things that mattered, and she had long since stopped pretending to herself that things did not matter when they did. He was a complicated thought. She did not have a framework for whatever was developing in the specific attention he paid her, and she was not going to build a framework before she had sufficient information for it. What she had was this: a week of observations, consistent data, and a man who had responded to the information she provided, not with surprise at the source, but with efficient action, and who had told her the truth about his reasons when she asked for it, and who had stood in a records room beside her, rather than in front of her. These were specific things. Specific things were reliable. She could work with specific things. The afternoon passed. The summit was entering its final day. The pack leaders were beginning the process of departure and farewells that ended every large gathering, the formal handshakes, the territorial confirmations, the careful social maintenance of relationships that would matter in the months between summits. Ren Cole found her near the garden in the late afternoon. "I heard what happened," Ren said. "The full version, not the corridor version. The session this morning." "Most people did," Ilara said. "How are you?" Ren asked. It was the same question Lena had asked, but it had a different texture in Ren's voice. Direct, and genuinely interested, rather than social obligation. Ilara considered the question. She had been asked it several times today, and had given the same answer each time. Fine, or all right, or manageable. She looked at Ren, who had sat with her in the garden, and asked her what she had seen in the room, who had given her a small, uncomplicated acknowledgement across a dining table. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I think I will be." "I am not yet." Ren nodded, as if this were the most reasonable answer she had heard all day. "That seems right," she said. "A week is not enough time to make sense of what happened to you this week." "No," Ilara agreed. They sat together for a while in the late afternoon light. They did not talk much. They did not need to. It was the particular companionship of 2 people who are comfortable in silence with each other, which is rarer than most people realize, and more valuable than most people credit. Before they parted, Ren said, "I hope wherever you go from here is somewhere good." Ilara thought about the open space, the future with no clear edges, the specific things she could work with. "I think it will be," she said. "Eventually." The final session of the summit that afternoon addressed the formal closing business, territorial confirmations, the signed record of the summit's official decisions, the administrative items that needed to be sealed before the gathering dispersed. Ilara sat through it in the hall. She was not required to be there. She chose to be, because she had been present for all of it, and she did not want to stop being present for the end. Kalen moved through the closing session with the same focused efficiency he had applied to every session, and she watched him do it, with the clear eyes of someone who was no longer watching primarily to gather information, but also, simply, because watching him work was interesting. He was very good at what he did, not in the obvious way that powerful people were sometimes very good at performing power. He was good in a structural way. The decisions were right, the timing was right, the specific words he used to close one topic and open another created exactly the right amount of transition without over-explaining it. He managed the room without anyone in the room fully registering that they were being managed. She thought about Leon saying he had been looking for something for 5 years. She thought about what 5 years of looking without finding felt like from the inside, for a person with that much precision and that little patience for things that did not work correctly. She thought about it with the same honest attention she gave to everything, and she found, quietly and without drama, that she had a clear sense of what she thought about it. She thought, with the specific certainty she reserved for things she had properly examined, he was looking for something that matches the way he operates. Precision for precision, directness for directness, someone who sees the room clearly and tells the truth about what they see. She thought about this, and then she set it down and went back to watching the session, because she was not the kind of person who ran away from her own honest observations, but she was also not the kind of person who made decisions out of single sessions of self-reflection, when there was still a great deal of information left to gather. The session closed at dusk. The formal record was sealed. The summit was, technically, concluded. What remained was the departure, the logistics of several hundred people vacating a summit site over the course of a morning, and the particular social period that always preceded large departures, the cluster of last conversations and farewells that people needed in order to feel properly finished. She ate dinner that evening with the Ashwood group for the last time. Lena was in high spirits. The summit had gone well for her from a social standpoint. She had made connections, been seen in the right company, positioned herself effectively for the months ahead. She talked about this with the pleased energy of someone who had executed a plan successfully. The other two girls were quieter, beginning to think about the journey home. Alara ate her food and listened to the table with one ear, and thought about the document in her bag, and the crack in a stone floor, and what it meant to be going home as herself, fully, for the first time. She thought about one more thing. She thought about it carefully, because it required care. She thought about what she wanted, not what was practical, or what was available, or what could be built from what was accessible. What she actually wanted, with the full, honest directness she usually reserved for external observation rather than internal inquiry. She wanted to do something with what she was, not for the territory in the abstract, not for the court as an institution, not for the historical record, or the bloodline, or the complicated architecture of the political future. For herself, she wanted to do something she could not have done before, and could do now, and she wanted to choose it, because she wanted to choose it, rather than because it was the most practical option, or the thing that was required. She sat with this question through the rest of dinner, and she did not answer it quickly, because she did not answer things quickly that deserved careful answers. She let it sit. She trusted herself to come to it in the right time, with the right information, in the full, steady way she came to everything. That was enough for now. That trust was enough. She folded her napkin. She said goodnight to the table. She walked through the corridor that passed the records room, and she paused for just a moment outside the door, acknowledging without ceremony the fact that something important had happened here. Then she went to pack. The last morning of the summit arrived with clear sky and cold air, the kind of morning that feels like a new start regardless of whether you have arranged for one. Ilara was awake before the dawn. She lay in her bed near the door for a while and listened to the others sleeping and the building around her settling into its quiet sounds. Then she rose and dressed and went to the window. Not hers, Lena's, because the window near the door faced a wall, and looked out at the grounds in the dark before sunrise. She had been at this summit for 8 days. She had arrived with a bag and a working jacket and a vial in her pocket, and no expectation of anything except the discomfort of being present in a context she had not been designed for. She was leaving with a restored bloodline classification, a grandmother she had always had but could now fully acknowledge, and something alive inside her that had always been there and would never again be pretended away. She thought about what Marin had said at the end of their conversation, when Alara was leaving the cottage. Her grandmother had taken both of her hands and told her that what comes after is yours. All of it. Every decision, every direction, every choice about what to do with what you are. She had been turning those words over for 2 days. The thing about choices, she had understood since she was very young, was that they only existed when you had something to choose with. For 19 years she had made choices inside a space defined entirely by what she was not. Not a wolf, not ranked, not seen in any formal sense as someone whose decisions had weight. She had made good choices in that space. She had been precise and capable, and she had done useful things without being asked, and she had built the kind of steadiness that does not require an audience. But they had been choices made from a position of fundamental exclusion. The bloodline record did not give her those years back. Nothing would, but it changed the position she was standing in for every choice that came after, and the difference between choosing from exclusion and choosing from standing was not small. She heard footsteps in the corridor. Familiar ones. She had spent a week learning the patterns of this building, and she recognized Leon's pace. Deliberate, measured, never hurried. She went to the door. He was there, holding a sealed document. He looked at her steadily. "The Alpha King would like to speak with you before departure," he said. She nodded and got her jacket. She followed him through the now familiar corridors, past the administrative wing, past the records room, where a crack in the floor one building over had changed the course of her life, to the private study on the second floor. Kalen was at the window again. He turned when she entered. Leon closed the door, and his footsteps moved away down the corridor. The early light was coming in through the window, and it caught the gray of his eyes in a way that made them look less like storm water and more like morning sky, which was a distinction she noted and did not assign more weight than it deserved. "You are leaving today," he said. "Most people are leaving today," she said. He held out the sealed document. "Your corrected registration and the formal bloodline classification certificate," he said. "The court copy is in the permanent record. This is yours." She took it. She did not open it. She held it for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, with the specific precision she gave to words that she meant precisely. He was quiet for a moment. She waited, because she had learned in a week that Kalen Dravon's pauses meant something was being decided, and that the decision was worth the pause. "There are practical implications to the bloodline status that we have not yet addressed," he said. "Legal standing, territorial rights. The question of what the appropriate formal position is for a silver blood carrier within the current pack structure. These are not small questions, and they do not have existing templates, because the status has been absent from the active record for 3 generations. "I know," she said. "The court will need to develop those templates," he said. "That process will take time. It will also require access to the historical knowledge that has been maintained outside the official record." He paused again. "Your grandmother." "Yes. I would like to meet with her," he said. "Formally, when the timing is appropriate, with your knowledge and consent." Alara considered this. She thought about Marin in her cottage, with the books and the maps and the jars, and the 40 years of carrying something alone at the edge of a territory, where no one asked her questions she did not want to answer. She thought about what it might mean for Marin to give that knowledge to someone with the authority to act on it in a way she had never been able to. "I will ask her," Alara said. "I cannot promise her answer." "I would not expect you to promise something that is not yours to promise," he said. It was such a matter-of-fact thing to say, and it was so precisely correct that she took a moment with it, because she was not accustomed to people being precise about what did and did not belong to her. She looked at him. The morning light had fully arrived now, filling the study, making everything in it clear. He was standing 3 feet from her, which was close enough that she was aware of it, and he was looking at her, with the expression she had spent 8 days cataloging, the one that was genuine attention, with nothing performed in it. "You are going to want to establish correspondence," she said, "to continue the process of developing the bloodline framework." "Yes," he said. "Through Leon, presumably." "That would be the formal channel," he said. "Yes." A pause. "There may also be informal occasions." She studied him. "Informal occasions," she repeated. He did not expand on this. He simply looked at her with those direct eyes and let the words sit where he had placed them. which was a very specific kind of honesty that she recognized because she practiced it herself. Say the true thing. Say it without decoration. Let the other person receive it without pushing. She found, to her own mild interest, that she wanted to receive it. She had not expected that particular discovery. She was honest with herself about it, which she was about most things, and she filed it carefully in the part of her mind where she kept things that needed time to develop before they could be properly assessed. Informal occasions would also work, she said. Something moved across his face, brief, contained, entirely genuine, in the specific way that things which are brief and contained can be more genuine than things that are elaborate. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "Safe travels." She said goodbye and walked out of the study, with the sealed document in her hands, and the early morning around her, and the particular lightness in her chest, of someone who has set down something very heavy and not yet grown accustomed to the absence of the weight. She packed her bag in the lodging room while the others slept. She was careful and efficient about it. She put the document at the top, where it would be easy to access. She folded her jacket and placed it on top of that. She made her bed neatly, because she had been raised to leave spaces as she had found them, and it was a habit she saw no reason to abandon. She walked out of the summit building as the sun finished clearing the horizon. The grounds were beginning to stir with the particular organized activity of departure, coaches being loaded, formal farewells being exchanged, the court officials managing the logistics of several hundred people leaving simultaneously. She moved through all of it with her bag on her shoulder, and her steady pace, and the document pressed safely against her side. She was at the gate when she heard her name. She turned. Ren Cole was crossing the grounds quickly, more quickly than Ren usually moved, and she was carrying something small in her hand. She reached Alara slightly out of breath. "I wanted to catch you before you left," she said. She held out a folded piece of paper. "My contact information. Hillside Pack, but also my own address. I spend half my time away from the pack these days. I would like to stay in touch, if that is something you want." Ilara took the paper. She looked at it. She looked at Ren, who had sat with her in the garden and asked what she had seen in the room, who had said, "I hope wherever you go from here is somewhere good," who had looked at her across a dining table on the first evening and given her a small nod that acknowledged her presence without demanding anything from her. "Yes," Ilara said, "that is something I want." Ren smiled properly, for the first time since Ilara had met her, which changed her face completely. "Good," she said. "Then go, and let me know when you arrive wherever you are going." Ilara folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket, where the vial had been. She said a real goodbye and walked through the gate. The road back to Ashwood was different from the road she had traveled to get here, not in its geography but in the person walking it. She sat in the coach and held the document, and looked out the window, and felt the difference in herself, the way you feel a healed wound, not absent of history, not unmarked by what had happened, but closed, complete. She thought about her mother, about the conversation that was waiting at the end of this journey, the real one, the one without the silence built into its structure. She thought about what Nora would say, and what she would say back, and she thought it was going to be hard, and necessary, and that they were both capable of hard, necessary things. She thought about the future, the open space, the edges she could not yet see. She thought about an empty morning, a clear window, gray eyes, and the phrase informal occasions placed precisely into the air, and left there. She let herself think about that for a while, not with expectation, not with a decision, just with the full, honest attention that she gave to things that mattered, and that she had stopped apologizing for giving. The coaches moved on. The summit fell behind her. The Ashwood territory appeared on the horizon in the afternoon, the familiar dark line of the forest, the shape of the hills, the particular pale blue of the sky above the ridge where she had spent 19 years. She was coming back to it different, not because the territory had changed, because she had arrived, finally, at the truth of what she was, not what she had been told she was not what she had been excluded from, not the gap in the record or the absence at the beginning of her name. What she was. She was the thing that had been kept and buried and forgotten and suppressed and maintained in secret at the edge of a forest by an old woman who would not let it disappear. She was 19 years of watching and learning and doing what needed to be done without being asked, and finding the useful thing, and building steadiness out of very few materials. She was the crack in the stone floor that was still there and was not going anywhere. She was the silver light in a dark corridor that had lit up 3 people's faces with the exact same expression, the expression of something encountering what it had no category for. She was the origin. And she was going home. The coach pulled to a stop at the edge of the Ashwood territory in the early evening, when the light was long and golden, and fell across the forest in the way that light falls sometimes, and makes ordinary places look like something out of a very old story. She got out with her bag, she thanked the driver, she stood for a moment at the edge of the road and looked at the tree line. Then she walked through it. Her mother was standing in the kitchen doorway of the pack house when Alara came through the gate. She had clearly been there a while. She did not say anything when she saw Alara, and Alara did not say anything either for a moment. They looked at each other across the yard, with everything that had not been said between them, present in the air, heavy and specific, and very ready to become speech. Nora crossed the yard in 4 steps, and put her arms around her daughter. Alara held her mother and felt the particular solidity of someone you love when they are physically present, the reality of a person against the theoretical version of them that lives in your mind between visits. She felt her mother's breath shake slightly at the exhale. She held her steadily. "I know," Alara said quietly. "I know now." Her mother pressed her closer and did not speak. Nora Voss had been carrying the weight of this for 20 years, and it was going to take more than a moment to set down, and Alara understood this and did not rush it. She stood in the yard of the pack house in the golden evening light and held her mother, and let the moment be as long as it needed to be. Behind her, she could feel the forest, the familiar dark and the familiar quiet. The cottage at the edge of the territory, with the lamp burning low. The territory she had been born into and built herself inside without knowing what she was building toward. In her bag, the document with the restored bloodline classification pressed against the fabric, clean and official and permanent. Her name, complete. Her name, finally, the full version of what it had always been. Above the forest, the first stars were appearing in the deepening blue. And in Alara Voss, something that had woken up in a corridor with silver light and cracked stone was fully awake now and entirely at home in her. Not roaring, not demanding, not frightening, just present, patient, ancient beyond measure and entirely hers. She had not been born without a wolf. She had been born as the source of them. And she was just beginning to understand what that meant.